What if you died a loser and woke up in the body of the Empire's biggest scumbag? Chris was someone you'd call a genius, could copy anything with just a single glance. When the apocalypse struck following the birth of the Demon King, he thought his story and his hero party was over. Until he opened his eyes 15 years in the past. Reborn as the Demon Clan himself. The very guy everyone wanted dead. Now, he's got 5 years to flip the script, stop the apocalypse, and become the strongest in the Empire starting from rock bottom. And now let's start diving into the story. The story began with a voice filled with dread and regret, confessing that this is how it ends. Hero Evans apologizes to everyone, admitting that he was too weak and that Chris should have been the hero instead of him. However, a girl stopped him from speaking like that and consoled him that they all did their best. She stated in agreement that if Chris, who was considered as a genius, had learned swordsmanship a little earlier, then maybe he could have surpassed 9 stars and become a 10-star hero. She wondered, if that had been possible, then maybe both of them, Hero, Evan, and Chris, would have been able to stop the end. Chris, on the other hand, who is regarded as the great extra due to his crazy talent that lets him learn anything in an instant, thinks about his journey of how he was able to leave behind a grand legacy of achievements and hence was given this nickname. The journey of this great extra started when he was 20 years old and had escaped from his damned clan, dreaming of success while working in back alleys. When the Magic Empire invasion by the Demon King of Carnage, named the Age of Destruction, happened, a recruiting notice for a party that would travel with the hero caught his eye. And Chris, at once, realized that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, where he would be able to achieve greatness, and once the war would be over, he would be able to enjoy wealth to his heart's content. Unfortunately, they all ended up failing, and the Dominion of Light had fallen into the hands of the Demon King of Carnage. The girl wished that if it were possible, she wished to turn back time so that Chris would be selected as a hero. Chris, however, thinks to himself that even if he had the chance to turn back time, he had no intention of doing all of this again since one life of suffering had been enough for him. And besides, there was no point in daydreaming about this now. Not when the world was about to come to an end. Chris, now realizing that this really is it, wished that in his next life one he didn't believe exists, but if it did, he hoped to be born as the son of a rich family. This was his last thought before he woke up and realized that he had regressed. He had woken up into the body of a young master of the Magic Empire. The place he was reborn in was the Dark Magic Clan, one of the 12 clans that supported the Magic Empire, and from what the newborn Chris could gather, he had traveled back 15 years appropriately, 5 years before the beginning of the Age of Destruction. While standing beside the window, Chris thinks to himself that he thought he would have experienced it all in his last life, but he had never thought that he would see a demon beast tending to a garden. However, that was not the most concerning thing, as Chris looked in the mirror with eyes narrowed since he knew whose body he was reborn into, and it was Christian Van Baron Kazar. Chris remembered a conversation he had with a girl while having lunch, where he had asked that with Van in Christopher's middle name, would he be a fiend of a branch family. The girl confirmed that it was right, and that the House of Count Kazar was a branch family of the Baron Countier, simply the Dark Magic Clan. To this, Chris had questioned whether it was relatively a weaker clan, and the girl denied, stating that while it was a branch family, it still has a good standing within the Dark Magic Clan, and not to mention how rich they were. She continued that she doubted whether he would be able to find any fiend within the Magic Empire who wouldn't be aware of the family. Chris had then shared that he heard about the 2 potential successors the family had, but the eldest son, Christian, was a real bastard who caused a lot of trouble, because of which Count Kazar had given up on him. The girl at that point said that it was all old news, to which Chris had asked if Christian had straightened up, but her response had been shocking that Christian had been murdered by his relatives. Recalling that information, Chris banged his hand on the mirror, cursing that he just wanted to become the son of a regular old rich family and questioned why he had to regress into the bastard that was destined for death. With dread, Chris leaned against the mirror and tried to think about what he should do, and so far he was aware that he had coincidentally woken up in the body of a boy who had a similar name to his about 3 days ago, and he was aware that Christian would die within 2 years. And the fact that Christian was eliminated within the House of Count Kazara family that placed great importance on honor meant that he was an absolute good-for-nothing. This gave Chris an idea that if he just stayed quiet and nice, then he might be able to avoid his death. However, Chris thought for once that since he had woken up as a rich kid, he should just take care of himself and enjoy the wealth and honor. But with a slap on his forehead, Chris realized that there was no way that could happen. He recalled that the reason the Demon King of Carnage started the war was to put humanity up as a sacrifice to complete Ragnarok, and by the time they had all realized, it already had been too late, and both the Dominion of Light and the Magic Empire had met their ultimate demise. So Chris knew that if he wanted to survive, he had to stop the apocalypse. Chris thought to himself that while the Demon King of Carnage was the one who had actually started the war, his main concern was the countless fiends of the Magic Empire that are loyal to him. So he was aware that if he wanted to stop this, then he had to become someone who was more powerful than the Demon King of Carnage. And there was only one way he could do it, by becoming the Demon Emperor and sitting at the pinnacle of the Magic Empire. Chris suggested to himself that since he had been given 5 years before the Age of Destruction began, he might as well try, and if he succeeded, then the entire Magic Empire would be his. With a loud sound of a hand angrily slapping on a desk, the scene changed to Count Khazar, furious at Christian, who snapped at him that he had ordered for Christian to stay in his room. Christian, who was kneeling in front of his father, said nothing as Count Khazar continued angrily that he could not believe Christian had no shame to be able to reveal his face after he had caused the incident. He warned Christian that if he acted out of line one more time, he would cut his head off. This scared Christian, as he contemplated that Count Khazar had a very strong, intimidating aura about him, and acknowledged that if he wanted to go forth with his plan, then he had to get rid of the good-for-nothing image that Christian had built up. So he apologizes to Count Khazar, stating that he had come there to apologize for all the wrongdoings he had committed till then. Count Khazar, who was physically taken aback by the apology, stared at his son in disbelief as Christian continued his apology and promised that it would never happen again. Count Khazar, however, was not impressed by the apology and accused Christian of mocking him, since how could he ask his father to believe him mere days after Christian had pulled his last stunt? Hearing that so many times, Chris could not think of what recent mess Christian had gotten himself into, and because he had heard so many stories, he couldn't even pick one out. But Chris, to the best of his knowledge, improvised the apology, stating that the fault for making his father lose his trust also lied in him, and asked if he was aware that Christian had lost a portion of his memories 3 days ago. Christian reasoned that in order to reclaim those memories, he had reflected on his past actions and had just now realized how wrongly he had been living his life. But Christian's efforts seemed to be going in vain, as Count Khazar pointed out that he had heard his excuses countless times, to which Christian commented that excuses made with words alone meant nothing, and that is why he wanted to show his father the improvement with actions. So he requested his father to send him to a punishment cave, where he wanted to remain for a month and would show his father that he had become a different him. Inside the punishment cave lies a prison which was used for high-status fiends, and was a palace where not only there was no light but all 5 senses were blocked. Even a few days inside were enough to drain someone's mind, but Chris found it perfect for him, as he needed a place where he could escape from the gazes of others. Count Khazar, now with a stance of disbelief, repeated whether Christian wanted to confine himself in the punishment cave for a month, and doubted him to be able to last even a single day. Christian admitted that he was aware of how difficult that palace was, but he thought that was the bare minimum to regain his father's trust. Count Khazar, now really shocked with that admission, argued about how many times he had this conversation with his son only for him to disappoint his father each time. But this time Count Khazar decided to play along to give him one last chance, but made sure to give Christian the warning that if nothing had changed after a whole month, then he would be banished from the clan. Christian, who still stayed kneeling, balled his fists, knowing that if that happened, then it would be equivalent to sentencing him to death. Chris was conscious of the long list of people who would be ready to take Christian's life once he be let go of the protection of the clan, so without a second thought, he lifts his head up to his father and announced that he understood, and that if he could prove that he had changed, then his father should grant him one request. Count Khazar looked down at his son and roared that he sounded arrogant, as if he was sure he would come out unscathed, but reasoned that if he could show his father that he had turned over a new leaf, then Count Khazar would grant any request. Count Khazar announced a comment that he didn't believe Christian could change as he eventually left the room. In the next scene, Chris, who sat in the chair admiring something in his hand, is informed by Cox, a half-vampire, and the house of Count Khazar's butler, that the punishment cave had been prepared. Putting down the object, Chris stands to get ready for the cave. As Chris and Cox went down the hallway towards the cave, Chris became hyper-aware of the whispering that was being done behind his back. He could hear the butlers whispering amongst themselves how the good-for-nothing had volunteered to enter the punishment cave and wondered what kind of scheme he was up to. He then heard one mention about the recent incident he had done where he had insulted the young lady of the Poison Magic clan, because of which the Count had to personally apologize to the victim. Chris gritted his teeth as he heard the remark of how embarrassing it would have been to save face against the rival clan, and they pondered when Chris would become more mature. Chris heard the butlers bet against themselves about how long would Christian be able to last, to which one responded 2 days tops. Soon, both Christian and Cox stood in front of the gate of the punishment cave, where Chris noticed how fitting it was to use Death Knights as guards for the Magic Empire. As he ran his fingers through his hair, thinking that as long as it stopped anyone from the cave, he was called out by someone. Chris turned back to see a familiar face who called him Big Brother, and realized that it was Christian's biological younger brother and a model student, Thurn van Baron Kazar. But as soon as he turned, Thurn raises his sword towards Chris, who although felt frozen in fear from seeing the sword didn't show it outright and instead in a very monotone way asked Thurn what his business was with him, since it didn't look like he was there to wish his big brother farewell. Thurn, with an angry and stern expression, pointed to Christian that he must be aware that he was a disgrace to the family, and while he wasn't sure what Christian was up to, but he warned him that if he tried to sully the honor of their family again, then Thurn would kill him himself. With his sword touching Christian's throat, he asked his big brother if he understood his final warning. As the sword itched a bit deeper into his skin, Chris comes to the realization that it must have been Thurn who would have killed Christian. Chris recalled that he had personally met Thurn before during the Age of Destruction, and he was a fiend famous for curse magic and couldn't help but admire how cute Thurn was in his childhood. While Cox, who stood beside Christian, was panicking from seeing the sword so close to the young master's throat, Chris was relatively calm as he pushed the sword away with his hand and figured that Thurn seemed to have trained diligently, but at the end, he was nothing but a brat against Christian, who happened to see the worst the Age of Destruction had to offer. With sweat trailing down his face, Thurn glared at Christian asking what did he say, to which Christian simply responded that he understood, but Thurn was not done talking. He, however, was cut short in his warning when Christian without any notice entered the gate, leaving Thurn and Cox both in disbelief. Thurn fumed with anger as he shouted at the gate about what was the deal with Christian's attitude. Inside the cave, Chris was now aware that he could not see or hear anything, but there was still faintest sensation left around his fingertips, which he bet was on purpose, so that the prisoners could feel the objects they had brought in, or else they might be starved to death. Trying to look at his hands, Chris comes to the realization that an ordinary person would have quickly felt mentally drained in such a place. However, that was irrelevant to him since he had experienced worse during his time as a treasure hunter. Besides, blocking off the 5 senses was something that he wanted since it would let him see further into himself. With a hand on his heart, he speculated that without it, he won't be able to overhaul his broken body, and not to mention the time and luck it required, but with the medical skills he suffered to master as the divine doctor, the bone compression art he modified from the body modification technique he had learned in the circus, and finally the magic stones of various different properties, he believed that it was certainly doable. As he held the magic stone in his hand, the same object that he was admiring before, he reflected how he had honestly thought he wouldn't be able to get a hold of magic stones, since they were expensive, but regressing in the body of a rich boy certainly had its perks. He found this to be the niceties of the elite clan where they had to heed his requests even though he was considered as good for nothing. He recalled how in his previous life he had even had to struggle to obtain them and laughed at that thought. Coming to the start of the process, he would begin it with the white magic stone which would purify the toxins. He found it to be boring but was an essential stage. So he sits cross-legged, ready for the process that requires him to tediously clean any toxic buildup across his body with white mana. He cautioned himself that even the smallest mistake would cause great pain across his whole body, and with body full in the concentration stance, he was ready since it was all a cakewalk for him. Cox, who had been summoned in the Count Khazar's office, is being asked how Christian was, to which Cox replied that he had obediently entered the punishment cave, but he was worried that it would break him so bad he won't be able to call for help, to which Count Khazar wondered if sending him there was a mistake. He recalled how Christian had such a promising future as a child, but couldn't understand how he broke apart so suddenly. He questioned if it was his gift that made him so arrogant, but whatever the reason was, Count Khazar would rather that his son be fully ruined or dead than live such a wretched life. Count started to have some expectations from the last time Christian had said that he would show his father difference in his behavior through his actions, but quickly stopped himself, since he was aware of how many times he had been tricked by Christian. He then asked Cox if he had seen anything strange when he entered, and when he noticed Cox to be hesitant and scared, he warned him to not hide any detail. So Cox, being scared of his master, spilled that Christian had taken magic stones in the cave, to which Count banged his hand on the table, while Cox continued that he had taken the magic stones, which included dreamstone that made one hallucinate, and since they don't know this side effect, they should immediately open the cave. But his words were cut off by the grim-looking Count, who declared no, and that if that was the case, then it would be best to leave him to die. 1 month later, Count reached the gates of the punishment cave, waiting to see if his son would be able to come out of it. He had no expectations and was sure that he must have been a wreck by now. But when Christian opened the door to come out, Count couldn't hide his surprised expression. Christian was pleased to see that his father had come to visit him and confessed that he had been waiting for him. When Count didn't answer, he asked his father if he was surprised to see him and reminded him how he had promised to return as a changed man. Count looked down at his son, and for the first time in a very long time, he could see the glaze he had, the same glaze he used to have as a child. But not wanting to express his feelings yet, he remarked that Christian had been able to successfully endure the punishment cave, which made Christian put his hands on hips, asking if that was a compliment. Count, however, crossed his arms and assured Christian to not get on high horses from something this minor, as he still didn't trust him, and this made Christian sigh, thinking how rigid this old man was, but still promised that this meant he just had to work harder. Christian thought to himself that his father must have thought Christian had barely endured the cave, but that was not the case since he was so busy with training that he had no time to be bored. Firstly, he made himself the optimal body so he could master swordplay, and thanks to the white mana stone, each and every cell in his body was basically bursting with life. Furthermore, the dream stone was a game changer, and he recalled when he could see Cox's pale white face, asking if he really was taking the stone into the punishment cave, and how he had tried to stop Christian from bringing a narcotic mana stone, but in hindsight, Christian was glad he had been stubborn. Recalling his experience in the punishment cave, he was thankful to the hallucinations, since it drastically reduced the time for metamorphosis. And on top of that, he was able to create 2 cores. Looking at the 1-star spell light back in the punishment cave he was able to gain, he couldn't help but think of himself as a freaking genius. Needless to say, Christian had used his darkness core to hide his light core, and was aware of the giant fuss fiends would make if they discovered it. Everything had been ending fine in the punishment cave when Christian recollected that as he turned back after hearing some sound, he had come face to face with the dreamstone, which only made him smirk and question the emptiness if it was really giving him the dreamstone. Christian was then aware of the fact that someone had hoped to get him high off it and break him down, but Christian was ready to take that challenge with the promise that he would use them as the sacrifice for his leap forward. Coming back to his father, he reminded his father that since he had kept his promise, he should now be allowed to make his request, to which, while Count tightened his jaw, still told him to speak. So Christian stated his request, which was to let him use the Black Swamp Knight's training ground. Hearing this request pulled a dark expression on Count's face as he spoke, not being able to fathom the audacity that a good-for-nothing like Christian would ask to be in that place, since they are one of the 3 orders of knights supporting the Dark Magic clan. Only the most elite knights displayed their skills there, and hearing his father's anger, he assured him that he only asked to be able to borrow the training ground since he believed that watching the bravery of the Black Swamp Knights would be a good influence on him, and assured the Count that he didn't wish to join their order. For a moment, Count stood there speechless, but after some consideration, he turned around after declaring that it was fine, and making sure that Christian heard his warning that if he behaved disgracefully before the knights but before he could finish the warning, Christian chirped in that he understood. But just as Count was leaving, Christian announced that there was one other request that he wanted. Christian, in the next scene, made his way into the knight's ground, which made everyone look at him in confusion. They all murmured what the foolish young master was doing there, and while Christian could hear them, he was sure that they were only able to badmouth a Count's son because he was in the Magic Empire, where strength was more important than status. In actual fact, there had been one more reason for Christian to come to the knight's ground, and that was entering the library, which was his second request, but his father had simply stated that if he was able to get the Deputy Commissioner Mellon's letter of recommendation, then he would give Christian the key. The reason that Christian wanted to enter the library was that it was where all the Count Khazar's dark magic grimoires were stored, and in order to learn dark magic, he had to gain access. Christian, back at the gate of the punishment cave, had asked his father why he was putting a condition on his request when he was still a member of the clan, to which his father reminded him of the time he tried to sell the advanced grimoires on the black market, and that too at cheap prices. This had shocked Christian, and he could think of the life his body had been living and now truly considered him as a lowly good-for-nothing. Pulling out his swords in the knight's ground, Chris reminded himself that his top priority should be getting the deputy commander's recognition, and before he could do anything, He was surrounded by the other knights present at the ground. Thurn, who was present within the knights, taunted him that this place was not one that a worm like him could walk into, and recognizing his little brother making fun of him, Christian couldn't help but think of him as troublesome. But after a moment of realization, Christian pulled a smirk on his face, coming to terms that this might be a good opportunity. Thurn angrily marched up to his brother, warning him that it was his final warning, and to go back since he mocked that Christian wouldn't want to throw away the life he so narrowly saved in the punishment cave. Christian looked at his little brother and with a smile, asked if he could truly stand by those words as it was their father who had allowed him to enter the training grounds. This shocked Thurn, but before he could muster a response, someone else chirped in that while she respected Count's decision, she didn't find Christian to be quite trustworthy. Christian turned around at the voice to find the deputy commander Melon, who along with the insult seemed to be imitating 4-star dark magic, and Christian understood that she was doing it to scare him off from the start, but he was used to threats like this. So he bowed his head in respect and greeted the deputy commander, who was taken aback from Christian being able to withstand her dark energy. Christian then pointed that since the deputy commander had also stepped in, he guessed that there was no helping it, so he would prove that he was qualified to use the training ground. He suggested to let him have a fight against one of the friends present there and win, and this suggestion stunned everyone. However, Christian assured them when asked that he wasn't joking, and instead he would like to request that they refrain from using the dark energy because of his debauched lifestyle. His capacity for the dark energy was far from what it might have been. Crossing his arms, he announced that he would prefer an unarmed duel if possible, which made Melon to give the suggestion some thought. However, she was also aware of how troublesome it would be if the heir got hurt, but she still questioned him if he thought he stood a chance in an unarmed duel. Christian to this smiled and innocently remarked that they would see about that, and as for whom he would pick as an opponent, he had chosen Thurn. Thurn found it insulting, and with glare as hot as the sun, he couldn't help but mutter, "How dare he?" But Melon pointed that it would be better for Christian to find a more suitable opponent, since Thurn's level is 2-star. 2-star is a level no ordinary 13-year-old could reach, and if one didn't possess the raw talent for it, then it didn't matter if they were 13 or 23. They won't be able to even scratch the surface of the level of power. But Christian, with his arms crossed, also knew that he wasn't just some ordinary bastard. He shook his head at Melon and pointed that if he was going to prove himself, he should fight with someone stronger than him, and he thought Thurn would be the best. With malice and challenge filled in his eyes, he asked Thurn about it and mocked him if he was scared of his older brother. Angrily, Thurn muttered that he accepts the duel. So all the students form a circle around Thurn and his big brother, with many making the remark for Thurn to take the opportunity to destroy the bastard, but Christian paid no mind to the comments, instead cracked his knuckles and asked Melon how they would decide who the winner was and if they would go on to fighting till the opponent surrendered. Melon at that statement couldn't help but find Christian insolent, since he clearly didn't know his place, so she pointed that it would be too dull, and for them to fight till one side is incapacitated. She stated that with the hope that since it had come to this, then it would be nice if Thurn would make Christian a cripple by breaking a leg or two. Hearing the rules, Christian turned to his brother, and with a fake expression of fear, he mocked him of what they were going to do since they said that Thurn was going in for a serious beating. Being mocked angered Thurn as he screamed at his brother and warned him that he would make sure that Christian couldn't run his mouth again, but before he could take even a step, Christian came flying in and punched Thurn in his face. Whipping his head from the sudden impact, Christian announced to the now wide-eyed Thurn that the fight had already begun. Rubbing the pain off his face, Thurn tried to punch Christian, but he was able to dodge the punch very easily. Christian found this be practically cheating since as Fiend, who hadn't even reached 1-star yet, he knew he didn't stand a chance against someone with dark energy, but in a bare-handed duel he was a master since he had fought countless battlefields in his past life. Christian then took his chance and kicked Thurn, who wasn't expecting the move in the stomach, making him bend down from the pain. Besides, Christian thought about that even if they only count the dominion of light powers achieved in the punishment cave, even then Christian was already at 3-star level. Seeing their model student hunch down from pain, everyone is shocked and couldn't believe their own eyes. Christian looked at his younger brother, and again in the fake and mocking voice asked if he was crying, and if he wanted to blow on his boo-boo. Even though angry beyond anything, Thurn yet calmly asked his brother what trick did he pull, but Christian, who was inwardly on cloud 9 as he found it refreshing to see his brother in such state, simply stated that he hadn't pulled any trick, and maybe it was just that Thurn was weak. Hearing that insult, Thurn quickly looked up at his brother and muttered fine again, to which Christian mocked him. However, Thurn had had enough, and accumulating his dark magic, he lunges towards Christian, promising that he will murder him, but Christian again dodges the attack, and while he stated that Thurn was quite quick, he still let his brother throw punches towards him. Once he had enough, he blocked one attack of Thurn, and as his skin touched Thurn's, Thurn could feel his dark energy disintegrating. This made Thurn flustered, and Christian, who was always aware that fighting is all about instincts, used the chance and threw a single punch towards Thurn, which sent him flying down towards the ground. Everyone stood with their mouths agape as they saw Thurn on the ground, and they couldn't believe that Thurn let his guard down, and speculated that maybe Thurn had withdrawn his dark energy because he was worried about Christian being hurt. Nobody could make any sense about what happened, and Christian, being finished with his task, turned to Melon and asked if this was enough to prove that he was qualified, to which Melon had no answer except yes. Satisfied with the result, Christian put on an innocent face while he prepared himself internally to devour everything, whether it be swordsmanship or magic. Christian sat in his room peacefully while looking at his dark magic, where he had managed to reach till 1 star. But since he was still not accustomed to handling dark energy, it took longer for Christian than he had expected, and not to mention the residue that was left over by Christian previously surely did prolong the process. He then rang the butler bell while he thought that for the wielding of power of light at the same time, he would need to raise his level even further if that was possible. Just then, Marie came up to Christian, who was his assigned maid, and Christian couldn't help but think about the troubles Christian must have stirred up previously, that he had been assigned a high-level evil spirit, a banshee, as a maid. Reminding himself to replace her later, he asked her to give him a juice, after which he had to leave to train. At the request, Marie suggested if she should make the juice with human blood, to which Christian responded to make it with strawberries. He then suddenly held in his breath as Marie came extremely close to him and responded that blood just tasted so good, and with a few bickerings about whether the juice should be made with blood or strawberries, Christian prepared himself for the training. As he was leaving, he was called by Cox. Turning around to face him, Cox questioned if he really was going that early for training, and that he was worried Christian might be pushing himself too hard. Sensing the emerging anger, Cox added that he was proud that Christian was working so diligently and that Cox had always been the one to believe in him when others had pointed their fingers at him. Hearing his statement made Christian very suspicious, and authoritatively asked who he thought of himself to decide whether he should believe in his master or not, since Christian himself had never asked Cox to believe in him. Cox was struck by his words and quickly apologized for overstepping his bounds, and with the good wishes for his training, he turned around and left. Christian, however, didn't move for a few seconds and watched Cox leave. He couldn't help but feel that there was something fishy about him, but nonetheless, he moved forward. Reaching the training ground, Christian noticed that the students' eyes seemed to be a lot more docile than before, and now, since their guard was down, he wondered if he should try to win them little by little. As Christian dropped his bag on the ground, he was noticed by another soldier who quickly made his way to report to the deputy commander that Christian had shown up at the training ground again. This put Melon in deep thought of what could Christian be plotting, so she recalled the duel Christian and Thurn had yesterday. She had noticed that Thurn's movements were definitely impressive, but to think Christian had disputed Thurn's dark magic at the right moment, and wondered if he saw right through the flow of the battle. Because if that was the case, then Christian might even be talented enough to surpass Lord Eshid de Baron, who was the direct heir of the main family. But she quickly let that thought go, since she still firmly believed that Christian was just a bastard, especially since he already had lost his dark energy through his debauched lifestyle. It seemed impossible for him to close the gap. This was her last thought before she heard commotion occurring outside the tent, so she came out asking what the noise was. She is then informed by a student that Christian seemed to have had a small conflict with a squire, and when she looked at where Christian was, she saw him standing above the unconscious squire holding the sword. The students all stood confused, not understanding what happened, since the squire, Cannon, was a 1-star fiend. Hearing this made Melon's eyes go wide as she realized that Christian had managed to reach up to 1 star. Christian turned to look at Melon, announcing that he wanted to see the renowned prowess of the great Black Swamp Knights. But it seems like they didn't live up to their reputation, so he asked if there was anyone else who would want to step up, mocking them that they surely were not a cowardly order of knights. This angered the knights, so one stepped up. He introduced himself as Torin, and Christian, who seemed way too relaxed, smirked, knowing that they all had fallen into his trap. Torin came towards Christian with his sword up, ready to swing at him, but Christian easily blocked the attack. He had never expected them to obediently teach him the knight's secret techniques, but if that was the case, he had no choice but to steal it this way. Christian pushed Torin's sword off him, and with a tight grip on his own sword, he recognized the swordsmanship from the grip angle and fluid footwork, which was the mud swordsmanship. Christian had only heard rumors about it, but wondered if he did it roughly then it would work, so he got ready and attacked Torin with the same technique he had used earlier, which ultimately led to him being unconscious on the ground. Christian sat on the unconscious Torin and proudly looked at the crowd. The students, on the other hand, were shocked as they couldn't believe that a good-for-nothing bastard was actually that strong, and Melon could only stare at the scene in front of her eyes. She realized that she wasn't mistaken back then, but her thoughts were Christian, who joked about how disappointing it looked since he had much faith in the knights. He continued mocking them that if their skills were that pathetic, then the deputy commander should bear some responsibility. Hearing these accusing words, the knights were all stunned, while Melon didn't take it lightheartedly, and commented that while she understood that he was happy about his victory, she warned that he was getting a bit carried away. Christian then stood up and pointed for Melon to then show him the skills of the Black Knights, and these words were enough to anger her as she took the sword. With a grim look on her face, she used her dark magic and made a huge crack in the ground, and with the dark magic surrounding her, she called to Christian a bastard that she could deal with in just a second. Sensing that she was using her full power, Christian commented if she really was going to use her full power with him and suggested for them to use dark energy only up to 1 star and to prohibit the dark magic, and as for the weapons, they would be using their wooden swords. Melon laughed at the suggestion, and with the flick of her sword she announced that she would break both of his legs with just half of that. Christian looked down at his legs and pointed out that if he was putting his legs on the line, what would she be putting? She came flying towards him while screaming that anything is fine, since he won't be able to walk away from there. She tried to hit him with her sword, which he again was able to block, and it seemed like he needed some extra strength to throw the sword away from him. The knights are watching the whole fight with keen interest, and they pointed out how Christian was able to hold out for a while, especially when they considered that he was up against the deputy commander, and to this one questioned that, wasn't it because the deputy commander's main weapon is a greatsword? Melon, on the other hand, was fuming because for some reason her attacks were not reaching him, and because she believed that he was a weakling through and through, she consoled herself that he shouldn't be a match against her. She recalled that when he had fought against Thurn and Torin, the same thing had happened, and sensing her being flustered, Christian mocked her by stating that looks like things were not going her way. This only angered her furthermore, and as she gripped her sword and lunged to attack him, Christian found a loophole, and without waiting another second, with might strength headbutted her. This caused her to lose her attack stance and held her nose in her hands. With a shocked expression, she looked at her, the blood oozing out of her nose, while Christian glared at her, not being able to believe that it worked. He knew that Melon was a spellsword, and as long as her dark magic was bound, the moment her defense would have slipped, she wouldn't have been able to block the opening with physical power alone, so he judged that if Melon was a fiend who focused on the sword, then his trick might not have worked. Melon, who still was looking at the blood, suddenly released a fit of laughter, stating that she would have never imagined that he would have headbutted her, but it seemed like she had looked down on Christian too much and promised to be more focused from now on. This made Christian confused as he pointed out that the fight was already over, since he had scratched her with his nail during the headbutt, and if he had laced his nails with poison, he was sure she would be aware of what could have happened. Throwing her sword on her shoulder, Melon accepted her defeat and asked him what he wanted, but she conditioned him that in return she wanted to have an opportunity to fight against him one more time. Taking the chance, Christian stated that if she needed a rematch, then she needed to heed a second request of his, then to which she agreed. So Christian made his way towards her and asked in a low voice if she would kneel before him. Melon, although taken aback by the request, argued that it was an impossible condition to meet since her loyalty lies with the main family of the Dark Magic clan. Christian acknowledged that he was aware that she was there on an excursion from the main family. However, he pointed out that it would resolve itself when he would become the young lord of the clan. Melon was dumbfounded by his statement and called it to be utter nonsense since the 5 young lords whose succession rights had been recognized are all from the direct descendant of the main family. Christian smirkingly pointed out that there was no rule that said that a branch family member couldn't become a young master, but in any case he accepted her request for the duel, which he suggested would happen in a month since he needed to train as well. But he conditioned that next time they would limit themselves to, which Melon proudly stated that then he would have no chance of defeating her, but Christian, being sure about himself, announced that few things are truly impossible in the world, which again left Melon speechless. With a hand on his chest and a respectful bow, he agreed to see her in a month, and promised to himself that on the day of their refuel he would make her realize with whom her loyalty should truly lie with. Christian then, without wasting any time, went up to his father and showed him the letter of recommendation Melon had written for him, and stated that Fiend's fundamentals were lackluster, and they needed to focus more on their training. Count, on the other hand, was reading the letter with full concentration. Melon had pointed out in the letter that Christian was a genius, and that even with his low-star rank he had easily defeated the ones with a solid foundation and even her. Count goes silent as he realized the intensity of the letter, and couldn't help but look at his son in a very different light. Noticing his father's stare, Christian asked him if there was something on his face, but Count assured him that it was nothing. He then gave Christian the key to the library as he had promised. Although Christian at first didn't show any emotions, he was inwardly with his progress, where he was not only able to obtain the library key, but was also able to exchange Melon's mind. Melon was a fiend from the main family of the Dark Magic clan, and during the Age of Destruction she was active as a 6-star high fiend, so Christian was aware that if he wanted to take control of the entire Dark Magic clan, then he needed to make her one of her people, and while he hadn't completely won her over yet, he was sure that 1 month would be enough to do so. As for Count Khazar, Christian hadn't missed the expression he bore on his face, and wondered if it was a look of father's pride, and guessed that fiends must have familial attachments as well. He hoped for Count to turn out even a better father than once he used to be in the previous life, and with the promise that he won't disappoint him, Christian made his way towards the library. Inside the library, Christian looked around at the different books, the blood magic summoning studies, curse studies, and all the books that are forbidden in the Dominion of Light. He then goes up to a book and pulls it out when from the other side of the rack he saw someone's eye. Startled, he jumped back only to realize that it was Marie. Asking her why she was there, she replied that she once was the librarian of this library, which came as a shock for Christian, but that shock turned into dread when she asked if he wanted to perhaps monopolize her as his personal servant girl, as he ended up screaming at her to shut up. Marie then noticed the book Christian had picked for himself, and pointed that the grimoire he chose contained a 4-star dark magic called Binding Seal, which he won't be able to comprehend. But Christian, after closing the book down with a smack, raised his ego by stating that it's fine since he was a genius. Marie, trying to be the best maid, tried to hype Christian by praising him, but he also understood that she was forcing it. Out of curiosity, Marie asked if there was a specific reason he had for choosing the book, which of course he had. Christian needed to catch the rat. While going on his training run with other knights, Christian let his mind wander about the rats he had in his book. The first potential rat was Thurn, since no one in the house despised him more than Thurn. The second potential rat was Cox, and while he was not a descendant of the clan, he did, though, have free access to the punishment cave. And not to mention that fiends have always prioritized power over social status, and yet Cox had always circled around Christian and tried to suck up to him. But he also pondered the fact that there could be a third party responsible as well, about whom he might not be aware of yet. But whatever the case, he was sure of one fact, and that was they wanted to see him ruined, especially after they had sent him a dreamstone in the punishment cave. This gave him an idea of whether he should act like the bastard they want him to be, and whoever looked happy with his acting would most likely be the culprit. So he begins his acting by exclaiming that it was too hard, and that he quit. As he left the training group, the other knights wondered what was going on with him. Back at his house, Count screamed at him while Christian acted like a brat, stating that the servants should have served him proper food so he wouldn't have thrown the plate. He then screamed at the servant to remake his food, which made the Count feel stupid since he had thought that Christian would have finally matured. With the heavy heart of his broken expectations, he walked out of the dining room, and while Christian felt bad, he knew that it was good for the family ultimately and hoped for his father to understand. So eventually, Christian worked his way hard into spreading the rumors that he has returned to being a bastard. He bullied maids while they were cleaning and wasted money like it was water, which had led to him asking Marie for wine. He then screamed at her as to why she wouldn't let him drink wine, to which Marie acted innocent that he was drinking wine. Christian, however, knew better and pointed out that she made the wine non-alcoholic, and Marie, dramatizing the alcohol vanishing, stated that he was underage so he could not be drinking. Christian tried his best to keep the persona and pointed it shouldn't matter since he was a good-for-nothing bastard, which made Marie question him if he had decided to be a bastard again, and assured him that even if he had, she would remain as his maiden forever. Creeped out by her, Christian admitted that, like he had said, he was catching a rat, and showed her his now mastered art of binding seal. Marie is surprised to see this, while Christian gloated that he had already told her that he was a genius, so he had modified the spell to be usable even at a lower star level. He confided that he wasn't just goofing off. Instead, he had been working hard at mastering various spells, and this made Marie truly wonder if he was really a genius. Just then, the door burst open, and an angry Thurn made his way towards Christian. Christian, upon seeing his little brother, quickly put on the act of being drunk and asked what he was doing there. With intense anger in his eyes, Thurn asked Christian if that was the best he could do, and confided that he had thought his brother had changed for the better. Christian smirked as he realized that Thurn was truly and genuinely angry, since it meant that he could be crossed off the list as a suspect. So Christian decided to confide in Thurn that he thought there was a rat in the house. His confession was not something Thurn had expected, because of which he questioned Christian, and Christian answered that someone in the house wished to see his downfall, and he intended on dancing to their tune for a while. Thurn questioned if that meant it was all an act, and as evidence, he made Thurn sniff the wine, which was fake. Thurn now believed his brother and asked the most important question, which was, who was the rat? Christian, while twirling the fake wine, answered that it was hard to say anything, but he was sure that they would be taking the bait any time soon, and with these words, he dropped the wine glass on the floor. Upon hearing the breaking of glass, a servant came running in asking if anything was wrong, and Christian, taking in the role again, exclaimed that it wasn't the wine he had asked for, and to order the butler Cox to bring him another. The servant apologetically answered that Cox was busy at the moment, and that response gave Christian the perfect excuse to pay Cox a visit. As he licked the splash of wine on his hands, Thurn couldn't help but think of how realistic his acting was. So Christian made his way into Cox's office where he slammed a wine bottle on his desk. Startled, Cox looked at Christian from his chair and asked what brought him there, but instead of answering, Christian, full in his character, poured the entire bottle of wine on Cox's head. Cox, silent from the shock, is informed by Christian that it wasn't the wine he had asked for, and asked if Cox was looking down at him, to which Cox quickly came to his defense. Standing up, he answered that he was not, and offered to fetch him the proper one immediately, but Christian refused. Christian wanted Cox himself to be the one to get it, to which Cox, who fisted his hands angrily, argued that he was in the middle of something. Christian, not taking the bait, said that since he would need to change his clothes anyway, Cox could bring him one along the way, and tapped his face. With gritted teeth, Cox promised to be back soon, and as he left, Christian stared at him, commending his patience to withstand such humiliation but noted that hostility. His thoughts, however, were disturbed when he saw the documents that lay on Cox's table. He picked them up and realized what he had already figured, that being a butler, who would be a rat, Christian had anticipated him to be doing some funny business with the finances. And while the documents proved that, it still wasn't enough, and he needed a real smoking gun. As he put the documents back, Cox came in with the wine he had asked for, to which Christian asked if he was mad at his master, and Cox warily answered that of course he was not. Satisfied with the whole ordeal, Christian complimented Cox that he was his favorite, to which Cox stated that he had a message for Christian that his friends wished to meet him in secret at the usual place. Christian, who was not aware of these friends, gave a confused look, and Cox again warily suggested that though he would rather Christian not be associated with them, he believed that it was not his place to judge Christian's friends. Getting an idea, Christian agreed to meet them, and he thought that things were going better than he had expected. Christian was now seated at the place his friends had invited him to, cross-legged. He heard his friends go on about how they heard that Christian had changed recently, but he was already the best among them. Christian's eyes then noticed the girl who was pouring them drinks, and couldn't help but think of his friends as trash who had hired such a young girl. One friend then offered him a drink, and as the friend kept on pestering him to take a drink, Christian threw the whole glass at the friend's face. Seeing the friend's reaction, Christian pointed out that they had tainted the sacred alcohol, and from the way they had reacted, he was sure that they knew something was in it. While the friends panicked, Christian, quickly using his magic, put the little girl into an unconscious state, which made his friends question how he knew dark magic. Christian, now irritated by them, put his foot on the table and pointed that now was not the time for them to be surprised, and grabbing both of their faces, he smashed them onto the table. One of the friends asked Christian to calm down, to which Christian declared, as he pulled out a knife, that if they still didn't know what they did wrong after getting hit, then they could just die, then and there. Christian had managed to tie both of his friends up after some good beating, and they confessed that they had been ordered to feed Christian the drug and then frame him after killing the girl, and that the guy had threatened them with the drug they were dealing in secret, so they had no choice. Christian then asked the obvious question about who was the guy that had ordered them, but when they hesitated to answer, Christian struck the knife on the floor and in between one friend's legs, threatening him that he would cut it off. Scared for his life, his friend confessed that it was Cox and begged for their lives and that they would do anything. Making them repeat it twice, Christian used his power and announced for them to listen well to what he was telling them and to carry it out properly. And as they both fell to the ground, Cox, on the other hand, ran into Count's office exclaiming that they have a problem. He informed the Count that the young master had committed murder. Shocked, the Count stood up in a panic while Cox continued that it seemed like he got drunk at night and killed the one who was attending his drinks and threw the body in the river. Cox, panickingly, told the Count that it won't be something they could easily overlook, but Count seemed to be in a shocked state, but with definitive words, told Cox to bring Christian to the fiend court, and with a grim expression announced that he invoked his immediate trial authority, which put a smile on Cox's face. Now inside the court, Christian had maintained his innocence while Count informed him that there were witnesses, but Christian questioned how that was possible when no crime had taken place. Hearing the surprised whisper, he stated that there had been a misunderstanding, and just as he finished his statement, the same young girl from before entered the court. Christian asked the court if this was the dead servant, and while everyone, including the friends, were shocked, the girl confessed that Christian had taken her home after she had woken up from unconsciousness and had even given her money to help her pay the rent. She then announced to the court that rather Christian's friends were the evil ones who had put drugs in his drinks. Eager to bring this to the climax, Christian activated his power, which made the friends to expel the truth that the murder was a false report, and they were given orders by butler Cox to frame Christian. Hearing the truth, Cox went into panic mode as he exclaimed what nonsense the friends were spouting and tried to manipulate the court by stating that he was being framed. He then turned to Christian stating that this joke had become too much, but Christian had known that Cox would react like that, so Christian asked the Count that being a victim of this incident, he had one request, and that was to allow him to act as a proxy of Count's authority to directly question butler Cox. Seeing the satisfied look in Christian's face, Count just warned him that if he acted in any way that was inappropriate, his authority would be revoked immediately, and ordered Cox to head to the defendant's stand. Christian, as he took his place, announced that as the representative of the greater ruler of the magic empire, His Majesty, the Demon Emperor, and as a member of the dark magic clan that governed the eastern region of the southern magic kingdom, and as a representative of Count Khazar, he would now question the defendant. He then asked Cox if he swore to only answer the truth, and when Cox agreed, Christian asked again, and once Cox agreed again, Christian took his chance and used a binding seal, same as he did before with his friends on him. The court was shocked to see how a mere brat used a 4-star dark magic, and since Christian had modified the binding seal so it could be used even with a lower star rank, there had been some additional conditions, such as he had to make the target swear twice, and it seemed like Cox had taken the bait. Using his power, Christian asked him what was the reason for him to hire the two friends to slander his name. And as the magic bound Cox, he replied that he had received an order, and that the man knew of his corruption, and threatened him and told Cox to ruin Christian. Christian pointed out that by corruption, he was talking about the embezzlement he had been committing for quite some time, and asked who was the guy who gave Cox such an order. Cox, after much pain and more magic, answered that it was the second son of the dark magic clan, Sir Eshid B. Baron. Cox, now aware that he had spoken the truth, planned on how to run away, but before he could make a move, Christian, using his own sword, cut Cox's head off. As everyone stared at him shocked, he announced that by the borrowed authority from the Count, he had punished the sinner. The Count, upon seeing the execution, walked up to Christian asking why was this the decision he came up to which Christian answered honestly that if they had left Cox alive, then the main family would have fabricated evidence and would have covered up this incident. And while they could not be indulgent with them, Christian wanted to ensure that everyone remembered the truth of it, that Eshid tried to sabotage him. Count, left speechless at first, ordered for him to follow him, and then, using his powers, he transported them to a secret ground. Count had taken them there since there were too many eyes in the courtroom, and questioned what he said no if he believed that Eshid would cause more trouble as a result of the succession conflict. As Christian nodded, the Count continued that a family's power and authority was directly tied to the successor they supported, and while he believed that Christian's decision was correct, he was scared that he may have acted hastily. However, with the way things were as they stood now, they would have the support of the first young lady. However, the first young lord wasn't an option since he was a crazed, bloodthirsty lunatic, but Christian chirped that there was another option and announced that he would become the successor. Count, for a moment, froze, but, jerking his arm, sputtered that it was nonsense, since someone from a branch family could only be recognized as a successor if they possessed the necessary ability. Christian, at that, reasoned that it was just a rule by name alone, but it wasn't enforced, and questioned his father why he thought Eshid wanted to sabotage him. Count at that confessed that Christian had been more talented than Eshid in childhood, but now he had lagged quite far behind Eshid now. But Christian was not worried about it since he was sure that he would make quick work of catching up. However, he did need his father's help. He requested his father to use his authority to recommend him so that he could participate in the sacred dark rite that was 2 months from then. Count warned him that in order to participate, 2-star level was needed, but Christian was only on 1 star. And to this, Christian assured his father that he would make sure to reach 2-star within the next 2 months. With his arms crossed and the best smile he could provide, he requested his father to help him out. Meanwhile, the whispers of Christian being a changed man had erupted, and they had even heard that the Count was personally training him, the very same training that even the senior knights struggled with. Christian and Count were seen training, where Count could not believe that he had just started training him about the black scythe swordsmanship today, and he had already understood it. While the Count was in shock, Christian questioned whether he really wanted to keep the technique separate that was to bind with the mud swordsmanship and then sever with black scythe swordsmanship, as his father instructed. Christian felt that there was a much more efficient way to do it, and using his trick, he severed the mushroom limbs with ease. Count turned towards his son in more shock, and Christian explained that with the human mushroom limbs it was hard to deflect with mud swordsmanship. But Christian had used mud swordsmanship and wrapped it in the black scythe's sword energy. Count, baffled, couldn't believe that a 1-star was able to pull it off, but assured himself by stating that it was quite powerful, but using 2 powerful techniques at the same time would make it difficult to use curses. But Christian admitted that it was actually very easy for him. In fact, it was barely an inconvenience. Count couldn't help but let his jaw drop. 15 days later, Christian was lying on the ground, tired out of his mind because of running. But he also knew that he couldn't half-ass this since stamina was the key to increase his power stage. Just then, Melon came by asking if he was already exhausted and reminded him that the duel wasn't far off since she was eagerly waiting for that day to arrive. Christian, as he looked at her, noticed the intense presence she always had around her and assured her that he was doing his best to meet her expectations, to which she pointed that while she was aware of the incredible growth he was nonetheless a 1-star, and if he failed to meet her expectations then he would never get her to kneel before him. Christian, while standing up, admitted that he was aware that could happen, and if it did then he was sure that he would learn something through the duel so it wouldn't be for nothing. Melon, making her way away, laughed that he was still full of energy and wished him to fight past his limits and to entertain her. Christian stared at her leave and thought that Melon was an upper 4-star. And within a single stage, there were 3 separate tiers, namely lower, middle, and upper. And while he was an upper 1-star, he was still way below her level. However, Christian did come from a rich family that is the wallet warrior and that raised a new smirk on his face, scaring the rest of the knights. Coming into his room, Christian asked Marie if she had finished packing his bag for the outing, but instead of a proper answer, he found Marie swooning at cloud 9, stating that it was their first outing together, so she had made sure to dress to impress. Pulling back from the brightness, Christian exclaimed that he never said she was coming with him, but Marie, as usual, took it as if he was caring for her so she wouldn't get a heat stroke. She assured him to not fret, since it had been her pleasure to serve him. Back at his conversation with his father, Christian had asked his father if he couldn't change his attendant to a human, and his father had informed him that he couldn't since he had made a master-servant contract with Marie. He stated that a high-ranking banshee could not be managed without a contract, and this shocked Christian, and he panicked and asked how he could void the contract, and his father informed him that he would need to share an intimate bond with Marie. This response only made Christian to pull on his hair and curse the old Christian. Coming back to Marie, he ordered that she could not come since he was headed to a place with lots of people. Marie, with saddened eyes, stated that she had hoped to come along with him, causing Christian to panic a little as he found a reason that it was just that her spiritual energy might injure people. Marie, with puppy eyes and big tears in them, stated that she had been stuck in the mansion for decades, and having no other choice, he agreed for her to come, but she had to make sure she won't show up in front of others. Now, happy with the answer, praised Christian while he simply stated for her to follow him, which made her question where they were going, and Christian answered to some place where he could make a profit. Marie, confused, pulled on her skirt, and as the money came out pointed out that he already had lots of it, which made Christian to drop his jaw as he exclaimed for her to put that back. Marie, however, was not done and kept on questioning, and being tired, Christian hinted that the money was for something he used to use before. And just as he was leaving the gates, he was scolded by a stern Thurn that he was late. Shocked to see his brother, Christian asked what he was doing there. Thurn simply stated that he was there to watch over him in case he again began behaving like a bastard again, to which Christian joked that he was merely on his way to gamble all of his money. Seeing Thurn's shock, Christian pointed that they were fiends, so it was a given that they would be close to alcohol and gambling was something even the Demon Emperor recommended, and besides, there was a reason it was legal. Hearing that, Thurn was still stern on his account that he would still follow him there, and Christian at that asked with sparkling eyes if it could be that Thurn was worried about his brother. This angered Thurn and exclaimed why he would be worried about him and that he was just concerned that Christian would dishonor his family. Nonetheless, Christian let him come, stating that it might be overstimulating for a little nerd like him, and when Thurn questioned that gambling was just a card game and assured him that he would make sure to flatten that cocky nose of his. Once they reached their destination, Thurn looked at the building in awe, not being able to believe that a building could look like that, to which Christian told him to stop acting like a country bumpkin and to wear the mask he was offering, since they could only enter if they had concealed their identity. Christian also ordered Marie to hide from people and to lend him her ear for a moment. After he whispered his order, Marie did as he asked, and both Thurn and Christian wore their masks. Thurn then asked where they were going, but Christian assured him it was nothing for him to worry about and that they were already late. Entering inside, a lot of people seemed to be noticing the brothers, where some whispered that they looked like born and bred suckers, to which the other answered for them to think they could walk into the lion's den on their own. Christian then announced to Thurn that he wanted to make a bet on who made more money in an hour, and if Thurn won, then he would call him older brother for a month, but if he lost, then he would have to call Christian as the honorable king. Emperor Majesty brother. Thurn, who was at first confused by the bet, was then ready to take the challenge when Christian mocked him if he was scared. Snatching the bag of money, Thurn walked away, stating that he would be going first. Christian had seated himself at a table, where a stranger stated that it was Christian's victory, and complimented that he was quite good at playing, and that if he played a bit more, he would be able to earn a lot. Chris always knew the casino was rigged. They let new folks win a bit, just enough to get cocky. Then they went in for the real kill once the newbie started betting big. And Chris, well, he'd seen this hustle 100 times, so he could practically smell the scam. But Thurn, his little bro, had no clue, so of course. He fell face first into the trap. Chris figured it was already over for Thurn, who was caught tighter than a fish in a net, so he told him he should just call it a day and head home to bed. But Thurn acted like he wasn't the only one losing, and Chris was quick to let him know he barely lost 500 rupees, which made Thurn say he was only down by 1,000. Everybody in earshot busted out laughing at Thurn's epic fail. Chris noticed the crowd was already treating Thurn like fresh meat and guessed those gambling sharks would start circling him soon enough. He asked Thurn if he was going to keep going, and Thurn snatched the cash right out of Chris's hand with a big grin. Chris just shrugged. He tried to warn him, but deep down he wanted Thurn to take a huge hit anyway, 'cause Thurn was the bait for his own plan. As the night dragged on, Thurn sat with his cards, sweating while cheaters watched his every move. Chris spotted the tricks plain as day, all their little hand signals and twitchy tells, and decided this was too perfect. Marie, who'd slipped in silent as a ghost, popped up behind Chris and let him know she'd found the folks he'd described. Chris told her she'd crushed it, and Thurn, absolutely spiraling over his losing streak, was barely holding it together while Chris and Marie snickered. Later on, Marie led the way, stopping in front of a door and pointing out that this was the place. Chris nodded and told her to open it up. As soon as they stepped inside, the whole room full of slick-looking goons freaked out. They demanded to know who he thought he was. Chris yanked his mask off and smirked, hinting that anyone with half a brain should know his face already. The room went ice cold. When Chris told them to get their boss, one guy dialed down the attitude real quick and started bowing and scraping, shocked that the notorious Chris had actually shown up. So that's how Chris finally met Grant, the head honcho of the Grant Merchant Guild. Grant was all smiles on the outside, famous for wheeling and dealing, but the real secret? He was running the casino too. Chris let him know he wanted to chat in private, and Grant tried to play it cool, asking what it was about. Chris didn't waste a second. He called Grant out for scamming his precious little brother, and then had the nerve to ask what brought him here. Grant nearly choked, asking if that sad sack in the tiger mask was really his brother. Chris set it straight, declaring Thurn was the true heir to Count Raiden Khazar. Suddenly, Grant went pale, stammering that he just ran the casino and had nothing to do with the cheats. Marie, wanting to spice things up, gave Grant a look so terrifying it probably haunted his dreams forever. Grant instantly crumpled and begged for mercy, promising that if he'd only known Chris was the Count's kid, he wouldn't have messed around. Chris raised an eyebrow, hinting he needed proof this wasn't just lip service. Grant offered to pay, asking how much Chris wanted. Chris casually tossed out a 1,000,000 rupee demand, which left Grant actually sweating, but Chris let him off the hook with 200,000 rupees instead. Grant couldn't believe his luck, and Chris let on he'd need something else too, but kept it vague. Later, Chris was all smiles, checking out new gear he'd snagged with the casino payout. Marie whistled at the clever play. She never expected Chris to blow all that money on equipment, and dubbed it a super scheme. Chris liked Marie's attitude, though what he really admired was the shine of his new blade. Marie raised an eyebrow at the sword, saying it looked familiar, and she soon remembered it was, apparently, Gruna, the legendary holy sword used by a hero who'd literally given up his soul to get it. Marie mentioned that every fiend in the region wanted it, but now it sat in Chris's hands all rusty and forgotten. Chris just grinned and said it was all part of the plan, shoving a necklace into Marie's hands. He remembered catching her gaze lingering on it, so he told her to just take it as a gift. Her jaw nearly hit the floor. Chris explained she'd never get over her regrets otherwise, so he wanted her to have it to help her move on. He told her not to get mushy or anything. Marie, floored, admitted she'd never gotten a gift before, not in life or after dying, and she blurted out her thanks, which nearly made Chris choke. He told her to hurry home, but she flashed him the warmest smile, promising to repay him with bigger and better blood juice. Chris groaned, wishing she'd knock it off with the blood stuff. Marie pointed out the strawberry juice he'd been cruising through was blood all along, which freaked him out just a bit. Suddenly Chris paused. He felt like something was bugging him. He'd totally missed a step. But well, he doesn't care. He will remember it eventually. Cut to the next morning. Thurn came blasting into his room, absolutely losing it. Chris woke up bleary-eyed, remembered he'd forgotten something, and Thurn straight up yelled at him for ditching him at the casino, saying he almost got pawned off as a debt slave. Chris shrugged and figured it was probably Grant who bailed him out. But rules were rules. They had a bet, and Thurn still owed him. Time to cough up some respect. Thurn looked crushed, squeezing a pillow so hard feathers flew, and after a bit, he blurted out esteemed over and over but couldn't quite get it out. Eventually he exploded, calling Chris esteemed king, emperor, majesty brother, at the top of his lungs, nearly tearing the room apart. Chris loved every second of it, telling Thurn to remember his place and work harder so he could win next time. Thurn swore up and down he'd get revenge one day. Chris joked, saying it was wild to think this cute kid might grow up and take out his big bro someday. It must be because he's the bastard of Eshid, son of Viscount Langham Baron, acting clan head and top dog among young lords. Chris honestly didn't have much beef, since he wasn't the real Christian underneath, but if he wanted to move up, he'd have to take that dude down himself. To do that, he needed Melon on his team, and the Holy Sword helped. Down in his training spot, Chris knelt over the sword, thinking about how so many people had tried to use Gruna, but now it was a busted antique because no one could make it work and tame it. He wondered if it'd react to him differently. When he grabbed his chains, the sword flared up with holy light, zapping his hand away. Chris just smirked. This was normal. It was designed to push back against dark energy, but at the end of the day, it was still just a weapon. If he could break through that barrier, it'd be his. So Chris started hammering at it, taking shock after shock until his hammers kept breaking, but he was stubborn, telling the sword it should just give in already. A little while later, training in the family's secret spot, Chris heard his father ask if he was all set. Chris said he was. A woman stood in front of him, looking familiar, and he finally realized it was Marion Baron, the Knight Commander of the Black Shadow Knights, his aunt, the Duke's own daughter, and his dad's big sis. She protected the Duke and handled all the clan's hush-hush work, including secret mission and internal surveillance. Chris couldn't help but wonder what on earth she was doing here. Raiden, Chris's father, told him that his Aunt Marion had come by because of stuff with Cox. Marion laughed and said Cox really had guts, but Chris figured maybe the Duke just wanted to make sure Eshid stayed safe and was kept hidden from this mess, which could be a real problem. He muttered that the Duke must have way too much time on his hands to care about these tiny dramas. Marion called Chris bold for saying that, but explained, the Duke didn't care about petty arguments between kids. He was actually interested in Chris. That caught Chris off guard. He figured maybe this was a big shot to earn some favor. Marion just shook her head, wondering if Chris was brave or just plain nuts, since he hadn't even reached 2-star rank yet but still wanted to duel Melon. She told him to call it off, but Chris thanked her for worrying and said he had his own plans while showing off his new sword. Marion recognized the weapon immediately and said if that was really Gruna, then Chris was officially insane. She always knew he was a bit crazy, but this topped it. Then she teased Raiden, finally mentioning his first name, saying he wouldn't stop bragging about how much Chris had changed lately. Raiden said he was serious, proud of his son's growth. Marion frowned and asked if Chris actually understood what he was doing, since using a holy sword in a duel was wild. Chris said he didn't care about the rules, just winning in whatever way it took. Marion issued a warning, reminding him even the Duke couldn't control Gruna, and that sword's power could burn him to a crisp. Chris just shrugged and started pulling the sheath off. Marion yelled for him to stop, freaked out as the blade shimmered with faint golden light. Nothing bad happened though, so she stared, confused, and asked if it was a fake. Chris tossed the sword to her and said she should see for herself. As soon as Marion caught it, sparks flew and she nearly dropped it. She glared at him, demanding to know how he could use it. Chris grinned that it was a trade secret, and the only thing she needed to know was he could do what others couldn't because he was just that much of a genius. Raiden looked like he was going to burst with pride. At that point, Melon popped up laughing, saying Chris was always full of surprises and fun. She joked that taming a holy sword was cool, but it wouldn't matter since he'd be toast by the end of today anyway. Chris coolly met her gaze. The duel started with Melon charging like a rocket, swinging her blade hard. Chris blocked the attack, thinking that her speed and strength were off the charts now, but there was no way he could catch up the usual way. When Melon pressed forward again, Chris blocked her a second time, and his holy sword started erasing the dark energy swirling around her blade. Raiden and Marion were stunned, realizing the sword actually pushed back against darkness like that. Raiden bragged that Chris had already surpassed Marion's skills when she was young. Marion said it wasn't over yet because Chris was still wielding the holy sword. They all saw that his hand glowed purple, clashing with the holy energy. Chris struck back, forcing Melon to block, and Raiden noted how intense the power was, even though Chris's dark aura looked unstable. But Marion spotted the truth. Chris wasn't losing control. He was holding his dark energy steady at just the right instant so the sword wouldn't reject him. Melon pulled back, so Chris asked her if she liked this battle. Melon admitted she did, but wondered if he was reading her moves. Chris nodded, saying he was just super observant. Every sword move started with a certain body posture. Even experts had to lift their arms and tense up before they could swing, so Chris just watched her shoulders and upper body for the hint. Melon smirked, telling him that wouldn't be enough. Suddenly, a green aura burst from her hands and started trying to bind Chris. She reminded him the Black Swamp Knights were expert spell swords. An explosion of holy energy busted out from Chris, and he admitted that almost tripped him up. She demanded to know if he had a purification artifact. Chris threw a nod to Raiden, saying he only survived thanks to his dad. Raiden looked puzzled since that item was supposed to be in the vault, but Chris confessed he was kind of a klepto and good gear was half the game anyway. Digging in his pocket, Chris whipped something toward Melon that exploded on contact. She dodged as best as she could, but Chris told her that dodging was pointless anyway. He tossed another artifact. This one hit and triggered perfectly. Chris said he bought it with the money from Grant, and loved how well it worked. He told Melon to stop hiding since he knew she was still good to fight. She sprang straight at him, blade aimed for his heart. Chris twisted his own sword, and met her attack tip to tip, smashing it hard enough to crack, and then shatter her weapon. Raiden watched, piecing it all together, and figured out Chris had flung a corrosion marble in the air. It was exactly what he expected from his genius son. Melon walked toward Chris, laughing and grinning, saying this fight was a total blast and asked what trick he was hiding next. Marion was freaking out, shouting that Melon had lost it and they'd have to intervene. But Chris just stayed cool, leaning away from the next attack before flicking his blade up and getting behind Melon in a flash, the sword at her throat. She looked genuinely shocked, and he pointed out that this was his win. He asked if she was satisfied, and the sword's edge even nicked her cheek. Raiden kept beaming. He was over the moon. Melon cracked up and admitted she couldn't calm down, not after a brawl like that. Chris reminded her about his request, but said he'd respect her wishes if she really wanted to walk away. Loyalty only mattered if it was real. She asked if sticking with him meant this kind of crazy fighting again in the future, and Chris squeezed her hand, promising to duel as much as she liked. Later, with the sunset glowing, Marion stood off to the side reflecting that Chris's way of working with dark energy was something special. She remembered how even the Duke had tossed the holy sword down, giving up. Marion asked if it was also hopeless for him to wield it. The Duke explained that he could only hang on for a moment, since dark energy waves changed all the time and you had to keep switching them so the sword wouldn't reject you. But that was impossible, unless maybe you were a demon of Gehenna, a demonic dragon, or maybe just an absolute maniac who could control dark power as naturally as breathing. Marion remembered how Chris had grinned at her after the duel, wondering if he'd managed to do enough to earn her praise. She actually looked pretty pleased, admitting maybe her father's the Duke long-cherished wish would finally come true because of Chris. Later, in the kitchen, there was a super sinister-looking dude going wild with a knife. He halved a strawberry and plopped it on a cheesecake so delicately you'd think he was an artist instead of a monster chef. Chris couldn't believe it, so this guy was the strawberry cake maker all along. Marie explained that, even though the orc looked evil, his cooking rocked. The orc wanted to know what brought Chris to his kitchen, and Chris said he was there to bake some cookies. Marie was all up in his business, asking why cookies, and Chris replied he wanted to give them to someone. Marie got dramatic, demanding if it was for another girl, and Chris rushed to clear it up. It wasn't like that. But technically, it was for a woman. The orc offered to handle the baking, but Chris insisted he wanted these cookies to be made by his own hands, since baking with heart was part of the magic. Before he could finish, some orcs decided that making cookies wasn't exciting enough. They started going absolutely wild, smashing strawberries into jam, flinging red splatter everywhere. Chris caught a blob right on the cheek. Looking at the strawberry carnage, he asked Marie if she was totally sure they weren't sneaking blood into the strawberry juice. Marie just started cackling like only she could. That evening, Chris spotted Marion just about to mount her horse. He called out to her, saying he'd heard she was leaving and wanted to give a proper goodbye. She said thanks and hoped he wasn't still tired out from his duel. Chris bragged that he felt fine, then showed her the cookies. Marion blushed a bit, surprised he'd gone so far as to make her a gift. Chris said he was just happy to see his aunt again, and simply wanted to do something extra. He thought back to just yesterday, grilling his father about what kind of food Marion was into, and Raiden had joked that Chris didn't even know how to win a woman over. Chris asked Marion to sample a cookie, saying he made them himself. Marion was suspicious, took a nibble, then got slapped in the face by how good they were. She said they were crazy tasty, and Chris seemed genuinely happy she liked them. Marion said a gift like this deserved something in return. Did he want anything? Chris didn't miss a beat. He asked her to become his true aunt from now on. Marion chuckled and asked if there was a hidden meaning behind his words. She guessed he wanted her support in the coming succession struggle. Marion sighed and explained that adults from the main house had to stay neutral in these things. It was the rule. Chris told her straight up he just wanted to grow closer to his aunt. But he also joked that if she decided to spoil him and secretly help out, he wasn't going to say no. Marion laughed and kept snacking on cookies. She said she didn't mind his honesty and that a nephew who baked like this was hard not to love. Chris promised her more cookies next time, as long as she didn't make him sad or he might lose the flavor, so she'd better behave. Marion just smiled and asked if he'd ever considered joining the Black Shadow Knights. Chris was about to talk his way out of it, but Marion cut him off. She told him he'd been amazing against Melon and might even outshine the Duke someday. But his rivals weren't lightweights, and she worried he'd burn out before his real talent could shine. Chris answered that he'd rather die trying to climb than never make the attempt. Marion was kind of stunned, but he thanked her for caring. He insisted there was no way he'd lose. She said for some reason, if it was Chris talking, she believed him. And even if he walked a wild path, she wouldn't stop him. She just wanted to offer one piece of advice. Beware the first young lady. Chris got confused, wondering why Marion said to watch out for Julianne and not Eshid, because Julianne was known as the gentlest of all the young lords. Marion only smiled, saying he'd understand soon enough. Chris thanked her and promised he'd remember that. Marion said goodbye and rode off, while Chris stood there thinking about the whole conversation. That night, Chris lay in bed with wheels spinning in his head. He thought about his aunt and his father. Both were 6 stars, and yet their names hadn't come up much during the Great War. It made him wonder just how many monsters might be hidden inside the Empire. He guessed their side had to be full of strong fighters, maybe even more than the Dominion of Light. Chris promised himself not to repeat past failures. This time, he'd get strong and fast. Then a whole month whooshed right by. One morning, Chris showed up as his dad called for him. Raiden said there was something important he needed to tell Chris, but then stopped short and stared. Had Chris really already made it to 2 stars? He called it flat out nuts to power up that much in a single month. Chris just shot back that a promise was a promise, so his dad shouldn't be surprised. Now what was so urgent that Raiden needed a private chat at this hour? Raiden explained that the main family finally responded. He'd submitted both Chris and Thurn for the Sacred Dark Rite, but only Thurn got approved. Chris's face fell as Raiden listed off the reasons. All that wild spending, the wild parties, the thieving, the drunken brawls, and the trail of wrecked property, you name it. Chris had done it. Raiden couldn't even argue, because all of it was true. Chris could only sigh. Sometimes, legends didn't get a break. and he'd have to deal with the punishment this time. Chris's father couldn't believe the main house would look down on his own kid. Chris wondered if Viscount Langham was behind the choice, but his dad shook his head. The Viscount had pretty much backed off since Eshid's little screw-up. It was actually Lion d'Aaron making these calls, a direct descendant, the main star of the next sacred dark rite. Chris went over what he knew. The sacred dark rite was no joke. Candidates lined up to absorb pure darkness from another dimension. And since there wasn't enough to go around, it turned into a brutal deathmatch for who got the biggest share. However high you ranked, that decided how much darkness you got, which would give you a huge leg up at becoming the next young lord, a clan heir. If Lion scooped up most of the darkness, Chris's goal of becoming the 6th young lord would be toast. Raiden clapped a hand to his heart and promised to fight for Chris, even talking Marion into helping if needed. Chris quickly shot down that idea, saying he'd handle things his own way. Raiden admitted he knew Chris had changed and become stronger, but told him to let the adults cover these house politics. Chris nodded, but his mind was already spinning up his own plan. Chris asked if any kids from Count Tiraman's house would be joining the rite. Raiden grumbled yes. Count Raman's 3rd son was in the mix, and that little punk had teamed up with Lion. That guy even called Chris a trickster who could only wrangle demon beasts, as if he didn't belong in the dark rite at all. Chris found it a bit funny, deciding his dad was more protective than he let on, and told him to chill. He just needed to prove his worth when the time came. The Tiraman, who would run the black pill hunt soon, were already beefing with him, so Chris figured joining as a driveman would be the perfect opening. Meanwhile, somewhere deep inside the main estate, Marion was updating the Duke. She said she had checked in on Christian as instructed. The Duke doubted her, remembering the genius from before as just a fake prodigy, a little brat who thought too much of himself. Marion replied that Chris was nothing like he used to be. The Duke sounded intrigued. He asked if Marion thought Chris could finally fulfill his long-held wish, a dream so powerful the Duke had even used forbidden magic to keep on living for. Marion said she couldn't promise, but Chris was closer to it than any before. That caught the Duke's interest. Still, he said Chris probably wouldn't even get to compete in the sacred dark rite, asking if that was what the rest of the clan thought. Marion confirmed it. Would the Duke intervene? Nope. He said a real beast needed to break through small obstacles on their own, not get help for everything. Marion insisted Chris deserved a chance, though he might only be a kid, but he was also a fierce beast who could go far if given the chance. The Duke's eyes nearly burned a hole through her as he rumbled at her not to cross the line. Marion realized she'd pushed too much and zipped it. The Duke explained he was always toughest on those he believed in. Then he asked if Marion was covering for Chris because she genuinely liked him. Ready to get busy, the Duke summoned Simon, the head butler. Simon drifted into the room, already looking like he was up to no good. Dude, this guy is straight up a villain looking. The Duke then told him to keep Chris under surveillance up to the right and report back everything. Simon asked if he could play a tiny prank while he watched. Marion stared at him, but the Duke just told Simon not to go overboard. Simon cackled and left, clearly cooking up serious mischief. Marion only hoped Chris could survive all this. Time skipped to Chris traveling by carriage through a village. He figured hitting 2 stars so quickly was thanks to his freakish talent, but even then, his stamina and dark energy reserves were still weak. Reaching 3 stars was impossible as he was. To get strong fast, he needed a black pill to build up monster-level darkness inside himself. Lucky for him, the Tiraman who would run the black pill hunt had just started picking a fight with him. Great timing. But catching the demon beast Courage off wasn't enough. The black pill didn't just pop out automatically. There was some rare requirement that needed to be met. Chris didn't go into details just yet. When his carriage rolled to a stop, Lardis came running up, grinning, asking why Chris was there today. Chris just asked how things were going, and guessed Lardis hadn't come empty-handed. Lardis played up the loyal servant routine, talking about a present, but Chris smacked it out of his hands. Lardis went all wide-eyed. Chris let him know he'd heard all about his sketchy side hustles like evading taxes at the gambling den, and they'd better stop. He wouldn't allow any really dirty stuff from his Happy Feet level minion. Chris said he'd let this one slide, but Lardis better keep it clean. Then, switching gears, Chris said there was something he needed, a gray pill. Could Lardis hook him up? Lardis explained the price had gone up lately. Chris caught the hint and turned to Marie, asking if she was ready. She suddenly started cackling like an absolute maniac, and poor Lardis looked like he was going to need a new pair of pants. Where had the adorable librarian Banshee gone? Even Chris could admit that sometimes Marie could get scary real quick. The moment Lardis saw Marie in action, he dropped to his hands and knees and promised to get the gray pill right away. Chris said things went so smoothly when everyone just cooperated, then added he also wanted a dagger good enough to slice through armor. Lardis looked totally lost, but Chris already turned and left. Not that Chris cared, Lardis wasn't a good guy, so he didn't feel bad for him. While they made their way back, Marie asked if it was finally time to go home, but Chris said there was still one more spot to check out. He spotted a potion shop and told the coachman to pull over. Inside, Chris stalked through the aisles, pointing out every potion he wanted to buy. Marie eyed the stacks of goodies and asked why he wanted all this stuff. Chris said he had his reasons, but things took a weird turn when Marie picked up an aphrodisiac, asking if this was for his personal use. She started to get the wrong picture fast, thinking maybe it was finally that time for the two of them. Chris got flustered, sweating bullets, and insisted it wasn't for him. Marie got all dramatic, even striking a classic JoJo pose, then guessed if it was for the Count. Chris muttered that it was, which made the shopkeeper nod knowingly, probably thinking Raiden's age was starting to show. Chris told the shopkeeper he absolutely had to keep this quiet for his father's reputation. The guy reassured Chris he'd be careful about it. Next thing, Chris was meeting Thurn, who called him over. Chris demanded Thurn address him by his full, over-the-top title, Most Honorable King Emperor Majesty Big Brother. Thurn, still embarrassed, said he'd heard the black pill hunt was dangerous and told Chris not to get hurt. Chris teased him, asking if Thurn was actually worried about him, but Thurn blushed and said it was just about having their promised duel later. Their father popped up, telling Chris to make sure he crushed those Tyraman punks. Chris promised he'd handle it and would bring back good news, while Raiden bugged Thurn to explain what all that King Emperor stuff from before was about. Thurn about died from embarrassment and didn't answer, trying to move the subject along. Not much later, at Count Tyraman's estate, a goblin butler blocked the entrance, telling Chris that he couldn't set foot inside the mansion. Chris's crew stepped up for him, shocked the goblin would dare talk that way to their guy, and asking if he even knew who Chris was. The goblin just stammered that he had orders from the young master, saying he owed Chris nothing and calling him a good-for-nothing bastard. Chris asked if that meant he'd have to get his own place to stay. The nervous goblin admitted it did. One of Chris's boys started muttering about chopping the goblin's head off, but Chris told him to relax and asked about who'd pay for the lodging instead. The goblin freaked out and said to just bill it to Count Tyraman. Chris gave a sly smile and asked if he meant it. Suddenly, cut to a shot of a massive, high-class mansion with jaw-dropping gardens, the kind of place that made you stop and stare. Some workers started gossiping, guessing that renting this place must cost 100,000 rupees at least. Chris just grinned and told everyone that sometimes, the best way to party was with someone else's money. He gave his crew 1 hour to unpack, promising they'd all go out for drinks after. But then he heard a weird sound coming from one of the bags. Marie jumped out from his luggage, gushing about how super the mansion was and how perfect it'd be to serve him here. Chris groaned, asking why she'd stashed herself in his trunks. Marie put on a showy, flirty act, saying she promised forever to be his maid, and teased that Chris must have missed her based on how shy he looked. Just then, someone stormed in, yelling about the crazy bill. Enter Aloy Tyraman, the third son of Count Tyraman, looking ticked off. Chris coolly explained that since he'd been refused a stay by the so-called Black Pill Hunt host, he just picked up a decent home instead. He joked that a true honored guest couldn't stay somewhere cheap. Chris taunted that if Aloy was so bothered by money, maybe he'd learn some manners from the lesson. Aloy, fuming, crumpled the bill and started casting a spell. A flash later, a fierce-looking panther leapt out beside him. Chris immediately recognized it, the Count's subjugation arts. Unlike regular taming, this twisted magic bent demon beasts to the caster's will through pure fear. There was all sorts of complicated stuff about mental attacks and hallucinations shoved in there. Chris realized mastering it would take time, but for now, all he wanted was to stomp the arrogant cat. He turned to Marie, saying that with a beast this scary, he'd definitely need a weapon. Marie popped open their storage, and Chris grabbed his favorite stick, daring Aloy to make a move. Aloy started ranting, summoning the panther to attack. In a blur, the beast lunged, fangs gnashing. Chris blocked with the stick, but the panther was strong. The stick snapped and sent Chris tumbling backward. Chris popped up, saying that fighting 2-on-1 was almost unfair, but all the better. If he won, he'd compete as a guard rather than a beast driver. It'd be enough for his plan. Aloy cussed him out, mounting the panther and threatening all kinds of smack talk. As the panther attacked again, pawing at the ground, Aloy scanned for Chris, only to realize he'd vanished. Suddenly, Chris was right behind him, whacking him a couple of good ones with the stick. 4 hits for good measure. Chris joked that he hoped it didn't hurt too much, and told Aloy not to cry. Aloy backed off, but Chris warned he wouldn't go easy, even if he blubbered. Unleashing a huge wave of killing intent, Chris freaked out both Aloy and his leopard. Instantly, the leopard bailed, leaving Aloy stood there, trembling like a vibrator. Chris smirked and explained he'd used a simple 2-star illusion spell, which was a bit too much for Aloy's beast control magic to handle. Aloy, still red-hot mad, started up another spell. A monstrous horse thing began to rise from the floor. Chris just asked if Aloy even knew who he was messing with. Taking aim, Chris chucked his stick like a javelin, smacking Aloy right in the forehead. Aloy's eyes rolled back and he hit the floor. Lights out. Chris didn't waste time waiting for any dramatic magic or fancy transformations. He just moved fast. And the poor demon horse got left stuck, still trying to claw its way out of the ground. It cut to Chris chilling at a gambling table, one leg up, flipping coins and acting like everything was cool. Some of the guys hanging around asked if he was sure this was the best time to be gambling. Chris shrugged it off, saying there was plenty of time left before anything important happened, and rest was rest, even if it meant having a little fun. They told him, though, this wasn't really taking it easy, but Chris just grinned and said he was good for nothing, so he might as well act the part. He shot the question to Marie, who immediately agreed and looked so happy about it. She only advised he not touch any alcohol, which felt like a complete tragedy to Chris. But hey, arguing with Marie went nowhere, so he let it slide. The goblin from earlier showed up again, mumbling about how Aloy wanted them all to keep an eye on Chris, even if it seemed pointless since he was such a loser. Chris suggested they come join his game instead, promising their master, who he had just flattened, wouldn't be waking up anytime soon. He swore he'd keep their little secret if they just relaxed with him. The butler brushed him off, telling Chris to mind his own business, but he just shrugged and told them to enjoy the show as they watched him gamble away. As the hours dragged on and night rolled around, the goblin and an edgy-looking hyena dude were still watching Chris. They assumed he really was a nobody after all, yawning and deciding to leave. Chris, though, opened his eyes the second they were gone and sat up, his face sharpening. He stood by the window, muttering that it was about time, and slipped out. He told Marie he had to step out real quick alone and not to follow. Marie eyed him, suspicious, immediately bringing up the aphrodisiac in his pouch. She joked that she always knew it wasn't for the count, but for Chris himself, she even started pouting about not being able to attend him at night, before perking right up to wish him luck with his nighttime activities. Chris rolled his eyes, told her to chill, and said it was all nothing like 17+ rated business tonight. Under the cover of darkness, Chris moved into the Keaton Mountains, a place thick with the energy of demon beasts, just like everyone gossiped about. He hiked toward the hunting ground, then found it. The place looked exactly as creepy as advertised, with only 2 guards, pretty lazy security by his standards. Good thing Marie had taught him that sneak spell, since he used invisibility to just slide right on by. Marie's voice echoed in his head, already making things sound weird, but he ignored it and pressed deeper into the hunt zone. At last, he found the altar where the Black Pill Hunt's final act would go down. It looked mad eerie. He suddenly remembered Lena, the fox-like girl from his hero party, and remembered how the true trick to getting a black pill wasn't just catching a beast, but scaring the beast so much it tried to give up its own life. It was all about hitting that peak of terror, flipping that emotion instantly into bliss, turning a gray pill into the real deal, which is black pill. That was why House Tiraman, experts at dominating demon beasts, ran this whole event. Chris thought it made sense, and, as usual, he had a plan. Hearing Lena's words in his mind, he figured the fastest way was to just copy their secret technique to control the beast, feed the courage off some of his mixed cocktail made from aphrodisiacs, let the thing panic, and then snatch up the black pill for himself. But time was tight, and there wasn't any chance for him to master their fear technique tonight. He'd just have to be clever and pull an alternate trick. Just then, Chris sensed some nasty magic in the woods. He paused, instantly alert, and followed it to check things out. Deep in the forest, he found a cave and threw his hood up before heading in. Inside, a wicked red aura rolled over him. He realized right away this was some serious bad magic. It looked like a crevice to Gehenna, the demon world, right here on human land. Chris freaked for a second, thinking about what would happen if he lured the courage off into here. He grinned, suddenly pleased. He even had the right tools for the job. All he needed to do was set the trap and wait for the hunt. Hanging overhead, a big bat watched him leave. As soon as Chris exited, the bat stretched its wings and transformed. It was Simon in disguise. Simon snickered, surprised at how crafty Chris was. He kicked Aloy's butt, made the guards let their guard down, and now, he was breaking all the rules by sneaking into forbidden areas. Simon couldn't help it. He itched to set up an even meaner prank next. Sliding through the fog toward Gehenna's rift, Simon shoved his hand into the demonic haze. Blood oozed out, soaking the ground, and a dark voice began to whisper, asking Simon what he wanted. A demon summoning sure seemed underway. See, this guy is a villain all along. The next morning, the hunt was on. Aloy was back in action, ramming his flag into the earth to claim the start. Chris rolled up too, thinking Aloy was trying way too hard to look cool for someone who'd just gotten stomped the day before. Aloy snapped at Chris to shut it, calling him the poser, and mocked him for bringing the holy sword when he couldn't even use it. Chris tossed back that it worked better than a club, daring Aloy to try him again. Aloy switched topics, barking orders for everyone to corral the courage off to the altar, then assigned a few on guard duty, including Chris, who was supposed to stay near the flag. Simon was blending into the crowd, and Chris caught a glimpse of Simon's bat figure. Aloy made Chris confirm he understood his orders, so Chris played along. Later, by the altar, one of the other guards sneered at Chris and told him to go elsewhere so he wouldn't mess up the hunt. Chris shrugged. Less work for him, and if things went bad, he'd just say he warned them. Aloy cut the tension, warning the guard not to wear himself out before the real hunt started, and told him to guard the flag. Chris did the most dramatic sit possible under the nearest tree, waiting for their big screw-up. He was locked and loaded with his dagger and gray pill for his own plan. When the group started tracking strange noises, Chris sensed it too. It was coming closer. Finally, he saw the courage off. It was supposed to be some deadly, high-ranking level 4 demon beast, but if Chris was honest, he thought it just looked dopey and weirdly lovable. Damn, that thing is so cute. Aloy's crew asked him if he was ready, and told him it was time to get started on the subjugation art. Aloy stretched his hand toward the courage off, and the rest of his crew threw down spells to try to slow the thing. As they moved in, something flickered in the courage off's eyes. It suddenly let out a wild screech and whipped its head toward Aloy. He barely got his hands up before the demon beast smacked the absolute daylights out of him, launching him to the floor. Everyone freaked out when they spotted poison leaking from the courage off's little feather tentacles, so they threw up a shaky defense ring around Aloy. But Chris, off to the side, simply grinned. He knew exactly what was happening. It was the aphrodisiac he snuck into the beast's system that put it so far over the edge. Aloy tried to save face, saying at least they already took the antidote for the poison, but warned his people they still had to be careful. The fight quickly devolved into chaos as the courage off started launching itself, wild, toward Aloy again and again. His team screamed for him, and Aloy just braced for impact, closing his eyes. To Aloy's surprise, he didn't get crushed. Someone blocked the attack between him and the beast. It was Chris, using the holy sword. Chris poked fun at Aloy's crew, calling them useless for making the poor flag-bearer step in. He offered to bail Aloy out, if Aloy would just call him Big Bro. Aloy cussed him out, demanding why he'd stoop to that. But the poison and chaos were getting to everyone, and Chris smugly held the line, saying he didn't have all day. Aloy gritted his teeth and finally caved, mumbling for Chris's help and calling him a jerk. Chris just said he'd better mean it, then clocked the demon beast with the sword's hilt. He quickly unleashed his own subjugation arts, wrapping spectral chains around the courage off, restraining it while Aloy stared, stunned that Chris could even use their clan's binding technique. Chris shrugged it off, saying it wasn't even a secret spell, it's just some intermediate subjugation art, so it was nothing for him. With practiced skill, Chris looped the chains around, grabbed them like reins, and leapt onto the courage off's back. The beast began screeching and took off running. Aloy panicked when he saw where Chris was headed and screamed for him to stop. He was getting way too close to the Gehenna crevice. But Chris was way ahead. After scouting last night, this was all part of his plan. He pressed closer, watching the courage off lose its mind. He boasted this was probably the first time the beast had felt the true malice of Gehenna. Chris egged the courage off on, forcing it to the edge. Its eyes flashed from red to a bright yellow, terrified to its core. Then Chris went for it, tightening his grip and stabbing the beast dead with his dagger. The group scrambled to him, anxious, warning the cave was extra dangerous and they needed to hurry out. Chris brushed them off, saying not to be wimps, and asked what they'd do. The pill the beast dropped wasn't even a black one. Aloy's frustration was building, but before anything else could go wrong, one of his guys asked Chris what he was going to do about everything since he'd butted in. Aloy said it was fine. They all got out okay, thanks to Chris. Surprised, Chris admitted he felt a little guilty. especially since he'd quietly swapped out the real black pill for a fake, but he had to keep moving. He reminded Aloy he still owed him a big bro. Aloy tried to wriggle out, saying he never made that promise, and besides, he was older. But the cave started shaking hard, the floor and walls vibrating like crazy. As rocks tumbled and people fell, huge glowing blue eyes appeared in the dark. Everyone froze as Chris realized what was happening, a real demon from Gehenna. Aloy, pale as a sheet, told Chris to cut and run, since he was an outsider and might get away. Chris's eyes flashed up, and he spotted Simon's familiar, a bat, up near the cave ceiling. Without hesitating, Chris flicked his wrist and flung his dagger straight at the bat, killing it. Before the connection dropped, Simon realized Chris had noticed the whole time, even knowing Simon had planned to intervene only after scoping out the demon's moves. But now, Simon's bat clone was done for, so he couldn't teleport there. Even rushing with his best blood magic, he'd need 5 minutes to make it there, and that'd probably be too late to save everyone. He turned on his heel and bolted, all thoughts of pranks gone. For now, he really did want to play rescuer. Meanwhile, the demon regarded Chris with curiosity, asking what tricks he planned to pull. Chris smirked and told him he just hated it when people tried to spy on him. The demon cracked up, saying Chris had a lot of guts for a dead man. Chris mentally analyzed the threat. For someone ripped straight from the Age of Destruction, this demon ranked on the lower end, but that still made it a 5-star, totally outclassing him for now. Lifting one hand, the demon began weaving a spell, while Chris, buying time, snapped his fingers and used his sleep trick, knocking out the bystanders like he did that one girl a while back. Aloy, surprisingly resistant, started shouting, demanding Chris wake everyone up so they could fight together. Chris mumbled a quick apology and then socked Aloy in the gut, sending him to sleep too. The demon leaned in, suggesting that if Chris would just hand the others over as sacrifices, he'd let Chris live and maybe even bless him personally. Chris spat back, telling him he never made deals with demons. He summoned his holy sword. The demon just sneered, saying it was useless without real power behind it. Then the demon let loose a dark magic blast, sending Chris flying, smashing him into the wall, and knocking him right out. Dazed, Chris was dragged up by the arm, the demon dangling him in the air and giving him a final offer. Hand over his friends and live, or deny it and die. Chris chuckled, spit straight at the demon's face, and asked why he thought he couldn't use the holy sword. Then, gritting his teeth, Chris managed to twist free from the demon's hold, flipping to land clean on the cavern floor. Channeling everything he had, Chris ignited his secondary energy core. The holy sword's tip rebuilt itself with a blazing aura. Now, the demon looked rattled for the first time. How could a dark mage like Chris wield the power of light? Chris just grinned wider, asking if the demon was finally worried his own life might end here. The demon declared that this wouldn't stop him. He began forming a massive red orb right in front of Chris. Chris got ready, spreading his feet a bit wider, and shouted as he used the Dead Sea cleaving light technique. He swung his sword downward, sending out a huge yellow wave straight at the demon. The demon couldn't believe what was happening as the attack hit him. He let out a terrible scream and collapsed to the floor, clearly defeated. Chris's eyes looked absolutely exhausted. He muttered that he had pushed his body way too hard. His vision started getting blurry and narrower with each passing moment. He began falling toward the ground, struggling to stay focused. In a flashback to his past life, Evan asked Chris if he had really copied his ability. Chris said it was something like that. Evan told him he was truly amazing, explaining that the Dead Sea cleaving light represented the single flash of light that splits the Dead Sea. But there was irony in it all. Even though Chris used this sword technique, he had failed to become the light of the Mir clan. However, Evan believed Chris would definitely become the light that saves the world. Back in the present, a blue finger touched a puddle near Chris, who was still close to death. A woman spoke, saying this was quite interesting. She introduced herself as Mafina, the first seed of Gehenna's 7th realm. Reinforcements were finally entering the cave with healing potions. Chris closed his eyes as Mafina said she looked forward to seeing what he would do in the future. The scene shifted to Count Tiraman's manor. Chris woke up saying his head was killing him. He couldn't believe he had been lying there for 2 whole days. What a total waste of time. But at least his body felt okay. He looked around for the black pill and spotted it next to him, thinking this was awesome. He remembered the whole Mafina situation, calling it unwanted attention. Sometimes fiends who stood out early got a demon's blessing and could grow stronger quickly. But he didn't really care since that was stuff bad guys received anyway. Besides, a 7th realm demon wasn't even that high level to begin with. A giant lion-like guy entered the room, asking Chris how his body was doing. This was the patriarch of House Tyraman, the Count himself. Chris greeted him and tried to get up to bow, but the Count told him to just rest instead. Chris wondered what was going on. The Count explained that yesterday they had put together an investigation team to check out the cave. It seemed like someone had messed with the magic circle that sealed the entrance to Gehenna. Luckily, it appeared the demon had been reverse summoned in the meantime. But even though it was just a brief moment, it was more than enough time for everyone to have lost their lives. Chris wondered if they really believed it was a reverse summon. It didn't make much sense, but it would be pretty hard for them to imagine that he had actually killed the thing. Since he didn't need to come up with an excuse, that was definitely a plus. The Count said he wanted to start with an apology. He was sorry for treating Chris so badly based only on rumors about him being good for nothing. He bowed and thanked Chris, calling him a benefactor of House Tyraman and saying he was grateful. Chris told him it was no big deal. As a member of the Dark Magic clan, he had just done what needed to be done since they were family after all. While it did bug his conscience a bit, he decided to muddy the waters a little. But it seemed like that really hit home with the Count. The Count agreed, saying that was exactly right. He told Chris that if there was anything he could help with, Chris should let him know. As long as it wasn't something impossible, he would make sure it happened. Chris thought about it, and said in that case, he hoped House Tyraman would let go of their old grudge against House Khazar. Instead of the enemy-like relationship they had now, where they kept showing their fangs at each other, he wished they could have a friendly but competitive relationship. They could plan for real progress together, which would be way more fitting since they were blood relatives. The Count started to say something, but Chris continued. He was sure the Count knew this too. The reason their two houses were feuding was because of the main clan's behind-the-scenes manipulation. From the main clan's point of view, if the branch families worked together, they might feel threatened. It was a scheme to keep them as nothing more than guard dogs. The Count asked if Chris was planning a revolt against the main clan. Chris said he had no such thoughts. To be honest, the Count couldn't believe Chris would think so far ahead like this. Chris just thanked him for the praise and asked if he would accept his request. The Count sighed, saying that for the first time in ages, he should contact Count Khazar. But before finishing his sentence, he called Chris's father by his actual name instead, Raiden. Chris smiled, thinking that was right. If they just united their forces like this one step at a time, they could build a much stronger front for the Age of Destruction. The Count then patted Aloy on the back, asking what he was waiting for, and saying his son had something he wanted to give Chris. Aloy looked embarrassed as he held out the gray pill, telling Chris to take it. He explained that when he had come into the cave, it was on the floor. Since Chris showed no signs of waking up, he had made sure to take care of it. Chris said if Aloy happened to be so grateful that he wanted to give him more stuff, he could totally do that too. Aloy started yelling at him, and the Count laughed, saying he would give Chris a gift instead. It was a summoning stone that could store up to a rank 4 demon beast. Chris said this was a really rare item. The Count told him he would also file a report so Chris could participate in the sacred dark rite, and wished him good results. Chris thanked him for both the gift and his encouragement. The Count told him to rest up as he and Aloy left the room. Chris smiled, and then told someone to come out from hiding. Behind the curtain, a red aura appeared, and Simon said that as expected, it wasn't just a coincidence that Chris had spotted him. To think that Chris could see through stealth magic that even the Count couldn't detect. Chris said he could smell the scent of blood on him. Simon then introduced himself as the head butler of the Dark Magic clan. That moment, Chris wondered if this meant Simon was the Duke's right-hand man. He then thought where he had heard the name Simon before. Then it hit him. This was the master of the Blood Shadow Mages. Chris knew the Blood Shadow Mages were bad news. They didn't care about the difference between the Magic Empire and the Dominion of Light. They were a totally psychotic organization that loved indiscriminate slaughter and terrorism. Their leader was a fiend who had reached 8 stars, and during the endgame of the Age of Destruction, he hit 9 stars and became the 10th Demon King. Chris couldn't even count how many times they almost died because of that maniac, and Simon was basically the blood and flesh of the Demon King of Carnage. Simon said he never thought the young master would be this incredible. Not only that, but to think Chris could actually take down a demon all by himself. Chris was pretty sure he killed Simon's familiar, so why did Simon know that he was the one who killed the demon? Wait, could Simon have actually witnessed the Dead Sea cleaving light technique? Yet Chris played dumb, saying he had no clue what Simon was talking about. Simon said he could tell Chris was being fake. After checking out the cave, even the demon's corpse had been completely wiped out, leaving 0 trace. It definitely wasn't a reverse summoning. For something to be totally vaporized inside that cave, Simon was impressed by Chris's skills. He wanted Chris to explain how he pulled it off, since Chris should understand that everything would be reported to the Duke. But Chris, just smug, asked why he should reveal his trump card. Simon reminded him that this would all go to the Duke. But Chris said that if he were the Duke, instead of wanting some little nerd who answered every question, he would prefer a predator who kept their claws hidden until the very end. Simon looked surprised, saying Chris was definitely an interesting person. Chris asked if Simon wasn't going to apologize. Simon asked what for. Chris explained that normally it was pretty tough to tell the difference between reverse summoning and total annihilation just from leftover traces. That's why the Count had thought it was reverse summoning. But there had to be a reason Simon believed the opposite, and it was actually pretty simple once you thought about it. Simon had been the summoner himself. A demon summoning case where a clan member almost died would be some crazy news that might even reach the Duke's ears. Simon said he would take responsibility, and Chris decided to keep it a secret. Instead, Simon should remember this moment, and that he owed Chris a huge favor. Simon looked shocked, asking if this was some kind of deal. Chris said it would be awesome if that's how Simon wanted to understand it. Simon said he got it and wouldn't forget the mercy Chris had shown him. It was great meeting him today, and he hoped to see Chris again soon. He would be counting down the days until Chris arrived at the main clan. Chris knew that Simon was someone who would play a major role during the Age of Destruction, so he absolutely needed to form a connection with him to change the future. The next day, Chris's luggage floated through the air as Marie said she had finished preparing for their trip home. He told her good job. That moment, Aloy opened the door and peeked in, asking if Chris was leaving now. Chris reminded him to use his proper title. Aloy asked what he meant. Chris said he had let it slide yesterday in front of the Count, but a promise was a promise. Aloy had to call him Big Bro from now on. Aloy said he had already told Chris he was 2 years older than him. Chris asked if Aloy had something he wanted to say. Never mind. Aloy came here to warn him. After hearing Chris talk about them all being family, he felt it wasn't right to do this to family. Chris should be careful since he was probably already aware, but the person most against his participation in the sacred dark rite was young Master Lion. Aloy explained that Chris should know that even 2-star levels weren't the same between main families and branch families. The best elixirs, the ultimate techniques of the main family, and blessings of dark magic, the starting line for direct descendants, was way further ahead than where branch family members began. Chris was going to be easy pickings. Chris smiled and said he would give Aloy a warning too, calling him Little Bro. He told Aloy not to participate in the upcoming sacred dark rite since he was saying this for Aloy's own good. Aloy said he was only speaking out of worry and wasn't going to let Chris hog all the pure dark energy. But Chris told him an ultimatum: no matter who his opponents were, they would come to regret facing him in the sacred dark rite. Aloy started getting ticked off, and Chris told Marie it was time to go. He told Aloy to think about it and not regret it later. Chris then headed back to the house of Khazar. Thurn went looking for his brother but was only told that Chris had gone straight to the training cave as soon as he got back. The butler said Chris wanted to train alone until the sacred dark rite. Thurn finally caught up with him and called him by his full ridiculous title, the Honorable King Emperor Majesty Brother. Thurn said Chris had promised they would duel once he returned. Looking at his brother, Chris was surprised by how much Thurn had grown in such a short time. He was already middle 2-star level, and was definitely growing fast. Chris said he was busy and needed to train. But then he realized Thurn was also participating in the upcoming sacred dark rite, and that wouldn't work. Chris told him to wait for now. They could duel after Chris finished training, and Thurn should train too. Thurn wanted Chris to promise he wouldn't push it back again, and that it wouldn't be anything like last time. So Chris better watch out. Chris said okay, and Thurn walked away. With that, Chris said Thurn was one stubborn brat. Suddenly, Chris remembered a girl from his previous hero life who had asked if he had really made a promise, and Chris realized Thurn reminded him a lot of her. In the training area, Chris sat on his bed and stared down at the little black pill in his hand. He looked real serious, thinking things through. He mumbled that he only had half a month left until the rite, so there was no time to waste. With a deep breath, he popped the pill into his mouth and started chewing. Instantly, his face twisted up, because honestly, it tasted straight up nasty, like butt. But he was determined, so he laid down and got to work actually trying to absorb everything the pill had to give. As the pill's energy began to flow through his pathways, Chris noticed something strange. The process was wild, way rougher than he ever expected. There was a weird sensation buzzing inside, almost like there was more to the pill than just darkness. He started to wonder, was that light force mixed in there? He figured maybe when the pill came from a dead monster, the happiness that the monster had felt when it died had become part of the pill. That explained why these pills were a nightmare for regular fiends to handle. None of that mattered for Chris, though. He kept pushing the energy through every single pathway he had, refusing to waste even a drop. He knew normal fiends would get help from a teacher to expel any light force left in the pill, but he thought, why let such good stuff go to waste? Instead of throwing it out, Chris planned to take it all in. He aimed to push the light force clean into his light core, soaking up both dark and light energy all at once. With both kinds of power whipping through his body, each headed to its proper core, Chris absorbed every single thing the pill had hidden. When he opened his eyes, they blazed with bright light for a second before snapping shut, flickering with deep darkness the next. The mix inside was crazy, but he held on tight. Sometime later, a new scene played out as a woman instructed someone to enter her office. A nervous man stepped in and said he had a report about the investigation she wanted. He explained that while they were hunting down black pills, there was this incident. A demonkin showed up, but he managed to survive the chaos. He apologized for the delay, saying the investigation took longer because he had to look into what exactly happened during that mess. She told him he'd done good work, and as long as she didn't have more questions, he could leave. As the man left, she looked down at a photo of Chris, and that woman's name was Idine. Skip forward half a month, and Thurn showed up in the early hours, pounding on Chris's door. He shouted that today was the promised day. Chris, wide awake, told him to come in. Thurn stepped inside and got a big surprise. Chris felt way more dangerous than before. His power just leaking out everywhere, even bigger than half a month ago. Chris joked that coming this early, Thurn really must be pumped up to get a kick. Thurn tried to play tough, but even his words sounded shaky. Chris teased that if Thurn wanted a beating so badly, he'd give it to him right now. But if he lost, he should just quit on joining the sacred dark rite this time. Thurn demanded to know what Chris was talking about. So Chris explained that the rite was a competition, and weaklings had no business jumping in. Thurn yelled for Chris to shut up and picked up his sword. Chris rolled his eyes, thinking his brother was so clueless about the actual reason he was pushing him. He just wanted Thurn to get the message, even if he had to bonk it into his head the hard way. Next thing anyone knew, it was all over. Thurn got flat out wrecked off screen, and they jumped right to the infirmary. Their father was there, looking pretty fed up, saying Chris went overboard this time. The healer said Thurn was going to be stuck in bed for half a month, so he would have to wait for the next rite to try again. Thurn tried to fight against it, but Chris cut in, saying he wanted a moment alone with his brother. Their father agreed, figuring it was good for them to talk as brothers. Once alone, Chris asked Thurn what he was sulking for, and told him not to whine. The fight was Thurn's idea in the first place. Thurn just glared and said Chris must actually hate watching him get stronger. He accused Chris of mocking him, looking down on everything he accomplished, and now, even purposefully injuring him so he couldn't join the sacred rite. Chris shook his head, telling him to chill because they clearly weren't on the same page. Chris confessed that he actually did this to help Thurn, to make sure he would get stronger for real. If they both entered the rite together, Thurn would always lose his shot at pure dark energy. Chris explained that he had to be harsh because Thurn was too thick-headed to get the hint. Most importantly, Chris said, pure dark energy wasn't even right for Thurn. Thurn was confused, so Chris started breaking things down for him. There were different types of dark energy, not just one. Pure dark energy was the top tier, but right underneath it was gray dark energy. That one was way more suited for curse magic. He pointed out that Thurn always crushed it with curse magic compared to swordsmanship. Right? Hearing that, Thurn wanted to know how Chris could possibly know that. Now, Chris couldn't just blurt out that he had seen the future, so he made up a decent excuse. He claimed he picked up on it through sparring together. Chris warned Thurn that if he took in pure dark energy before nailing down gray dark energy, it could cause problems later when he tried to master it. Sure, it wouldn't make things impossible, but pure dark energy's special qualities would slow him down, and Chris wanted Thurn to get strong as fast as he could. He told Thurn to think it over before the next rite, and said this was all honest advice from a big brother who wanted the best for his little brother. Thurn actually looked touched for once. Then, Chris pulled out a little gift, a pill. Thurn's eyes went wide. He knew it was a gray pill, something seriously valuable. He wanted to know why Chris would give him such an expensive thing. Chris just shrugged and said it was because Thurn was his little brother. Why else, right? Anyway, of course our greedy-ass MC already took something. Yeah. This weak-ass pill is nothing compared to the black one Chris eat before. Suddenly, Thurn got super emotional and started tearing up. This was some real wholesome brother stuff. But then, he sniffed and wondered if Chris had always been capable to be a brother. Why did he act like such a jerk, even when their mom was dying? Did Chris even know how much pain their mom went through? Chris went quiet and sat beside the bed. saying he just didn't get it back then. It was a heavy moment. Later, the story jumped again, this time to the carriages coming to a stop. Chris hopped out and stretched, complaining his whole body ached from all that travel. He grumbled that the least they could have done was open a warp gate for him. These dudes were being way too petty. But that would all change once he became the clan's head. Marie came flying in with excitement, her voice ringing out as she gushed about how she couldn't believe it was just the two of them going on a date. She joked that her heart couldn't take it, though Chris casually pointed out that she didn't even have a real heart in the first place. He explained to her that the main family only let him bring a single companion, and because Marie was basically stuck to him by the terms of their magical pact, she was the only one who could come along. As they walked, Chris spotted a bunch of people whispering about them. Marie nudged him, saying he was already super famous and getting all this attention. Chris could sense all eyes on them and caught snatches of conversation about how weird it was for someone like him to stroll around so confidently. Suddenly, Simon's voice cut through the noise, calling out and addressing Chris as young master. People around them turned, shocked to see Simon, the head butler, showing respect to Chris. The crowd started buzzing, wondering why someone so important would bother greeting the so-called troublemaker. Some folks whispered about what business the Duke's aide could possibly have here. Simon ignored their chatter and smiled, remarking how, even though it had only been half a month, Chris had changed so much and grown stronger. Chris just rolled his eyes and asked if the Duke's right hand really didn't have better things to do with his time. But Simon replied with his usual calm, saying that wasn't the case at all. He had come here specifically on the Duke's orders. In fact, the Duke wanted to meet Chris in person. Simon also noticed that Chris didn't seem shocked by the news and called him out, wondering if he had been expecting something like this. Chris admitted he was surprised, but Simon didn't buy it. He swore Chris had barely flinched. Later, the scene shifted to the clan head's elegant chamber. Simon stepped in and announced that he had brought Chris as requested. Sitting inside was the Duke, looking as serious as ever, and Marion was there beside him. The Duke glanced up, greeted Chris, and told him that it had been a while since their last meeting. Chris couldn't ignore the crazy intense gaze suddenly aimed right his way. That presence was so overpowering, he could barely keep it together from the pressure alone. He felt his hands start to shake as the dark energy poured out of the Duke, even when knowing Chris shouldn't be able to stand up to that kind of force. It was low-key savage that the Duke flexed like this on someone weaker, but it really showed his strength. Chris lowered his head and greeted the Duke anyway, manners on lock. The Duke got straight to the point, wondering out loud if Chris wasn't surprised by this little pop-up meeting. Chris replied that he kind of expected to be called. The Duke wanted to know why that was, and Chris explained it was because a new star had just popped up in the clan, so of course the attention was coming his way. The Duke actually laughed at that, saying Chris was spot on. The Duke noted that even Marion and Simon complimented Chris, but he remained uncertain about his expectations for him. The Duke then went on, dropping some wisdom. He reminded everyone that no matter how promising a young seed might look, time was the only thing that could tell how it would grow. Sometimes saplings shot up fast, but withered away before anything came of them. Chris agreed and said honestly he was still too weak to meet any big expectations yet. The Duke asked if that meant Chris didn't see himself living up to them in the future, but Chris only said that the future held all the answers. Maybe he would become a great tree, maybe even something weird and wild enough to throw shade on the whole forest. At the least, he promised he wouldn't let the Duke down. The Duke laughed again, pleased. He said he'd hold high hopes for Chris, then dismissed him. After Chris left, Marion looked at the Duke, wanting his thoughts. He told her that Chris was even more than he hoped for. But big talent always drew trouble, and storms were brewing for the Magic Empire. Even so, hope had sparked today, and that was rare. Marion looked honestly shocked. The Duke finished, almost to himself, saying that maybe, just maybe, Chris could fulfill the wish he'd been holding on to for so long. After that, things moved right up to the night before the sacred dark rite. Someone announced super loudly the arrival of Count Raiden Khazar's eldest son. Yup. None other than Chris himself. Everyone was showing up dressed to impress, but he still caught shady whispers. People wondered why the Duke would even bother meeting with Chris, calling him a good-for-nothing and a total gigolo. Chris just shrugged. He figured it was obvious. It was the price of being just way too good-looking. Marie ate that up, throwing in her full support, hyping him up like only she could. Chris's attention slid over to the drinks table where he immediately locked eyes on some bottles. He really hoped they were serving alcohol, but as he reached for a glass, a waitress totally shot him down. She reminded him that he was underage, and the best she could do was hook him up with some ginger ale. Folks around started to laugh at him for that. Chris grumbled that this party was lame. He wanted the real stuff, not ginger ale like some little kid. Pretty soon, the big intro started for all the young nobles. The doors eased open, and a line of elegantly dressed young lords and ladies stepped out. Chris took mental notes. Introductions flew by. Eshid came in as the second young lord. Then Julianne stepped out as the first young lady, those two he recognized. The less familiar faces showed up too, like Jupian, the second young lady, and Mysak, the third young lord. Funny thing was, the whole group only clocked in at 4. One was missing. Chris noticed right away that the first young lord was a no-show. Then, with a grim eyes, he wondered what Eshid would say since that little game of his had tarnished Chris's own reputation recently. But Eshid, the jerkboy, just walked by, not even giving him a glance. That annoyed Chris because he thought the dude should at least look him in the eye after all that drama. Did he think Chris was just some useless ant that fun to mess with? But then Julianne, all grace and poise, gave Chris a polite greeting, the kind where someone lifts their skirt ever so slightly. That nearly threw him off. He recognized her right off, and remembered how his aunt warned him to keep an eye out for Julianne. But honestly, she didn't seem dangerous. Chris figured he'd just tuck that info away for later. He'd done enough recon for one evening. It was time to bounce and prep for the right. Right as he turned to leave, a man showed up behind him, clearing his throat. He introduced himself as Fowler, and let Chris know he was a summoner working under young Master Lion. Chris, only half paying attention, asked why any of that mattered. Fowler said he heard someone unqualified was entering tomorrow's sacred dark rite and worried that an amateur might mess things up and embarrass the clan. Chris asked straight up if Fowler was really talking about him. Fowler said if that wasn't the case, all Chris had to do was prove it. Chris glanced up at the higher floors and saw Lion giving him a not-so-friendly look. Chris thought to himself, if Lion had a problem, he might as well come down and work it out between them. Chris was game for any challenge. In fact, he wanted to see what party tricks Fowler had packed. Fowler brushed that off, saying this wasn't the place, he didn't even have a weapon on him right now. Chris laughed, asking if Fowler was for real. He doubted he'd need a weapon anyway, not to handle a rat like Fowler. But Fowler promised Chris would regret crossing him. Chris just shrugged. He was pretty sure regret would be on Fowler's side in the end. At that point, both Jupian and Julianne were watching Chris, especially Julianne with intense curiosity. A while later, the rest of the guests started getting loud with surprise. Suddenly, it became obvious why. Chris was chilling, getting the royal treatment by a pack of spirits who were feeding him grapes and basically treating him like a king. Fowler, on the other hand, was getting tossed around by his own summoned evil spirits. They straight up turned against him with just a wave from Chris. The crowd lost it, whispering about what kind of power would let spirits flip their master so fast. Just then, Chris raised an eyebrow and looked at Lion on the balcony. He asked if that mess was really what Lion wanted. For a direct heir of the Dark Magic clan, that was just embarrassing. If he had beef, he should have come down for a proper duel. Lion, looking embarrassed, snapped back that this whole thing wasn't his fault and had nothing to do with him. Chris just laughed, telling Lion that not even a fool would believe his story, but he would let it slide this time. He said that they would face each other again during the sacred dark rite, and threw in that Lion sure was acting cowardly, but he would get some real manners knocked into him soon anyway. The day of the dark rite started, and Chris showed up yawning as he walked in like he hadn't gotten enough sleep. He wasn't even pretending to be nervous. Aloy moseyed over and asked if Chris honestly didn't feel anxious after stirring up such a mess the day before. Chris shot back, calling him little bro and asking why he showed up after all, especially since Chris had warned him not to get involved. Aloy got flustered, wanting to know how Chris could just think he would willingly skip the sacred dark rite, stating Chris must be out of his mind for even thinking about it. While they were talking, Lion came down the stairs, glaring at everyone like he was king of the place. Chris looked up at him and told him just to wait. Then a voice belonging to an old man broke into the conversation, asking if everyone was gathered. He introduced himself as Sebastian, the vice butler in charge of the main mansion, and told everyone he would be leading them to where the sacred dark rite was going down. With a tap of his staff, the ground lit up in wild, trippy colors, practically turning the whole area into some kind of acid dream. People stopped to stare as a spiraling stairway began to rise beneath their feet. Chris thought to himself that it wasn't exactly what it looked like. He figured it had to be some kind of illusionary art that created a fake space just for this. As Sebastian strode off down the magical stairs at a crazy fast pace, panic broke out. Everyone realized they were getting left behind. Sebastian wasn't joking around, and if anybody wanted to keep up, they had to totally hustle and stick close to him. People grumbled about how weird the place was. A couple of them whispered about how it felt like they were going underground. Not just down a staircase, why was the slope so steep anyway? Even Lion and Aloy could be seen stressing and working hard to keep moving forward. Sebastian yelled at everyone to hurry up, warning the ground wouldn't support them forever, and a bunch of kids actually started falling off the stairs straight into the endless void. Sebastian, deciding they needed more motivation, announced he was picking up the pace. He moved even quicker, and that sent more participants tumbling down. Lion tried to act tough, sneering that anyone who couldn't keep up deserved to fall behind. Privately, though, he was sweating bullets, surprised when Chris cruised right past him. Chris was chill as ever, not sweating or panting at all. He teased Lion, asking if he was already out of breath, and commented that as a direct heir, Lion really should be better at this sort of thing. Surely, Chris joked. They'd shoved plenty of good potions into Lion. But in the end, this guy is all bark and no bite. Then he explained why hardly anyone could keep up. There was no need to waste effort in an illusion. In a fake space like this, it didn't matter how hard you ran, your stamina wouldn't drop, not unless you actually believed in the illusion. Chris revealed he just twisted the spell a bit and made himself basically invincible. Sebastian noticed, his face lighting up, and guessed that Chris was Christian, the young master from House Khazar. Eventually, everyone staggered to their destination, completely wiped out, while Chris showed up looking fresh. Aloy, about ready to collapse, wanted to know why Chris wasn't even tired. Chris grinned and told him that if he'd trained his body instead of always riding his beast, he might not be so gassed now. Just then, a different voice chimed in, welcoming everyone as a crystal floated into sight. The voice introduced herself as Rahu, the manager of the sacred ground. She explained that they were standing inside the sacred darkness, a place where the purest dark energy on the planet gathered and exploded out. Today, she told them, the plan was to win great pure darkness. Just like the third-ranked Demon King, the original founder of the Dark Magic clan. As she spoke, blue light wove itself under every person's feet, and she let them know there wasn't enough for everyone, so not all would share in the reward. Every demon beast on their path would test if they were worthy. Chris, always direct, asked if what she was saying meant it was a race to arrive first. Rahu said that was a pretty sharp observation. Chris kept pushing, wanting to know what would happen if someone got into a fight with another participant. Would they both get disqualified? Rahu explained that everyone would be put on a different path, so direct conflict was random, but if it did happen, the smart move was to avoid fighting since time wasted let the others get ahead. As she counted down to the start, she wished everyone good fortune and told them to focus on staying safe. When the countdown hit 0, chaos broke out as everyone sprinted off down their own path. On the sidelines, Sebastian invited Rahu to place a bet over some blood juice on who would emerge victorious, but Rahu simply vanished, leaving Sebastian feeling like he got ghosted. Ah, poor old man. Sebastian seemed so chill though. Lion began racing confidently down his tunnel, running into a swarm of demon beasts. He wasn't scared. Fire danced in their mouths as they attacked, but Lion powered up his hand with aura and smashed one after another, sweeping them aside with ease. He bragged to himself that these were just easy second-tier monsters, nothing for someone at his rank. At the same time, he was pretty sure Chris's path was loaded with even bigger threats because he'd secretly bribed a mage to make sure of it. As far as he was concerned, Chris wouldn't be making it out alive because the rules ignored any deaths that happened during the trial. Lion felt confident this would be Chris's grave. Finally, Lion reached the door to what he guessed was the finish line. He boasted to himself that, of course, he was the first to arrive. But when he opened the door, he saw Chris inside waiting, looking bored. Chris casually asked what took him so long, saying he nearly died waiting. Lion, shocked, asked how Chris got there ahead of him. Chris answered like it was no big deal, explaining there wasn't much to it. Lion said it's not possible since Chris's path should have had much stronger monsters, but then he realized he'd slipped up and tried to cover it, but it was way too late. He'd already admitted to pulling some strings, a truth that definitely wasn't meant to get out. Chris couldn't help but grin as it all came together in his mind. No wonder those beasts on his path acted way tougher than normal. It had all been Lion's little scheme. When Lion tried to shut him down and demanded who he thought he was to throw accusations, Chris just shrugged and said that with only the two of them here, there was no point in putting on a show. Formalities could take a hike. Lion, hot-headed as always, snapped back and called Chris an arrogant jerk, reminding him it was taboo to fight during the rite, but saying he would go ahead and crush Chris anyway. He lunged forward, swinging with everything he had. Chris saw it coming from a mile off and smoothly dodged every attack. He noticed Lion was using some kind of magic combat arts, a rough style with bursts of magic power at close range, meant to snap joints or take down an enemy in one surprise move. Still, nothing landed. Chris slipped by each wild strike, which only made Lion madder. Eventually, Lion saw what he thought was an opening as Chris's hand dropped a little. Lion charged, super confident he'd snagged a win, yelling that he was about to break Chris's bone. But Chris called him a fool, grabbed Lion's wrist, and twisted him right into a brutal armhold. He told Lion not to cry, even if it hurt, then snap. The sound was sharp, and Lion's scream echoed down the tunnel. Aloy came running up not long after, worried he'd missed out on the whole thing. He came around the corner to find both Lion and another competitor flat on the ground, completely wrecked. Aloy was wide-eyed and asked if Chris was the one responsible. Chris teased him for being slow, wondering if Aloy was going to pass out now or if Chris needed to help put him to sleep. Aloy wasn't backing down, saying he hadn't just been loafing around, inviting Chris to come at him. Of course, he stood no chance and got folded just like the others. Chris could only shake his head at the déjà vu, figuring that if he left them here, someone would find them soon enough. Then, Chris's mood turned serious. Looking ahead, he laid out his plans. In 5 years, the first great war with the Alliance would break out, and by then, he needed to be holding all the power of the Dark Magic Clan. He couldn't afford to share one drop of the sacred darkness with the others. Now that everyone else was out of his way, he headed to take the full prize for himself. The sacred darkness wasn't just another fancy thing, it was the very power that gave a fiend the shot to become a true transcendent. The Duke, who had taken up 80% of it, was already one of the strongest demon monarchs out there. The Dark Destroyer, the legend himself, had absorbed over 90% to become a demon king. If Chris could manage to claim every last bit, 100%, it would mean he could surpass even the Demon Emperor. Standing before the roaring, swirling energy of the sacred darkness, Chris reached out slowly and let it pour into every pathway in his body. It was overwhelming, but he pushed forward, determined to make all of it his. Back outside, chaos was breaking out. News started spreading. Every competitor except Chris had been eliminated. People were freaking out, calling it a disaster, with rumors flying about young Master Lion being in critical condition. Gossipers accused Chris of cheating, maybe using banned magic tools, and demanded he be investigated and punished. Jupian, not missing a beat, told everyone to chill, saying Chris wouldn't be able to reach the sacred ground anyway. Since he hadn't come out after 2 whole days, either he was still absorbing all that darkness, or he'd already been crushed by it. Even the Duke himself had only managed to absorb so much before hitting his limit, so Jupian was sure Chris was done for, probably dust by now. As she walked away, Jupian looked furious. She muttered that even if Chris somehow survived, she'd take him out herself. She remembered how after her father died fighting the Alliance, only she and Lion were adopted by Viscount Langham, which meant her status in the clan was shaky. With Lion out of the running for successor, she feared no one would back her and all of it was Chris's fault. She swore revenge as she stormed off. Others kept up their trash talk, saying Chris the good-for-nothing still hadn't come out, so he was likely dead. They called it payback for overstepping his limits. Some snickered at Marie, Chris's loyal partner, saying even the ghost was waiting for her dead master. Marie, not one to take trash talk lightly, shot a magic hole through somebody's bag in warning. She smiled sweetly, warning them to shut up or she'd turn every last one of them into ghosts to serve her. They scattered right away, while Marie dialed back to her cutesy mode, and whispered to herself that waiting for a man sure wasn't cool, but she knew her young master would be back soon. Meanwhile, on the inside, Chris was drenched in sweat, struggling hard. The sacred darkness was no joke. It felt like endless night was strangling him, and he was barely past 70%. It was already way harder than he guessed. He pushed on, knowing the real battle would be at 90%, and if he tried to take more than his core could handle, it'd shatter and he'd die before any war had the chance to start. He tried to think his way out, then remembered, if only he had a dragon heart. Dragons had the biggest, strongest cores around. Maybe, just maybe, if he could mimic one for even a few minutes, he could survive this trial. Summoning that image, he pushed even harder, letting the energy storm through his system as his core began to shake and splinter. He felt himself about to break, knowing this was his absolute limit and he had to stop. Just then, a new voice called to him, Mafina, appearing before him as a towering demon woman in that shadowy void. Chris was taken aback and asked how a demon could be in this space. Mafina explained that the power of demons was to communicate through darkness. Being here was child's play for her. She offered to help him, no strings attached. Chris, always skeptical, asked why. Mafina simply laughed, saying it was just a whim, and told him to take her hand to claim all of the sacred darkness for himself. 1 week later, the main room felt tense as the Duke put his teacup down. He murmured that it was tough to even suggest Chris was alive. There had been absolute silence from the sacred ground. Marion seemed puzzled as she wondered how Chris could be so greedy for power that he'd go that far. Simon added that even Viscount Langham agreed, and now wanted to close the path to the sacred ground as soon as possible. The Duke sat there and thought. Then Simon asked if the Duke would give him the order to close it now. Really, Simon was just trying to spark a reaction, testing the mood in the room. The Duke asked Simon what he honestly thought. Did the reckless kid still have any chance? Simon admitted the odds were basically zero, but said Chris was so different that he couldn't say for certain. The Duke weighed it all and finally decided they would keep the path open for exactly 1 more day and not a minute more. Marion let out a sigh of relief, and Simon promised to pass along the Duke's decision. Deep inside the space of darkness, things were looking grim for Chris. His dragon heart core was already shattered into pieces. Pain ripped through him as he clutched his chest, coughing hard. Mafina stood there, urging him to take her hand quickly before it really was too late. But Chris locked eyes with her and stubbornly refused the offer. Mafina called him a fool. She pointed out that there was no way for a human to survive in a place like this. But Chris just smirked, reminding her of where they stood, inside the space of concepts, where rules got blurry. With that, a massive lightning bolt slammed down toward him, washing the darkness with wild white light. Mafina was caught off guard as a white aura began swirling around Chris. His eyes burned dark red, horns sprouted from his head. He had gone full demonization. This technique was legendary among the mystical Dark Mage clan, an ultra-secret and super forbidden trick that would let a mortal jump into demon form and bring out impossible power. Usually, this came at a price so bad that even big names in their history had died from it. But in this weird space of concepts, if he left out all the crazy magic-boosting incantations, he could build a vessel with no painful payback. Chris looked completely strained but focused as he shaped the energy, molding brilliant light in his hands and letting every last drop of sacred darkness roar into his vessel. Now he could smash past 90%, or even take it all for 100%, a mark most had never even dreamed of reaching. Mafina couldn't hide her shock, calling Chris in front of her the Black Crescent Moon and demanding to know how a simple mortal, an insect, could cause such a rift in darkness dimension. She demanded to know just who or what Chris was. Chris just glanced at her and shrugged, saying she really ought to know by now. He pointed to the sky and declared he was a genius of another level entirely, then ripped open a portal to exit himself right out of the dimension. Mafina just laughed, amused and still amazed, telling him she couldn't wait for their next meeting. Chris honestly didn't look thrilled, but as he left, he shot his hand back through the rift and flipped her the middle finger, telling her to fuck herself. Mafina could only stare in disbelief before bursting into more laughter as Chris vanished, and he grumbled to himself about her being beyond annoying. Definitely not someone he wanted to see again. He wondered how much time had passed, guessing it had been about a week. He figured there must be chaos breaking loose at the manor waiting for him to finally pop out. Letting the demonization melt away, he decided a little prank wouldn't hurt. It cut to the mansion, where a butler rushed to Viscount Langham, announcing that young Master Chris had returned. Some couldn't believe the guy was even still breathing. Viscount Langham, acting head since the chaos, stiffly told the butler to continue. The butler explained that Chris barely survived and was extremely fatigued. The healer chipped in, saying he could still sense Chris's dark magic, but it had turned oddly murky, probably meaning Chris will likely have difficulty wielding magic properly in the future. Right away, people muttered that, of course, the delinquent couldn't have handled over 80% of the sacred darkness. Some darkness even spilled out and was lost because he'd been too greedy, so clearly, Chris was to blame and had to pay. Viscount Langham nodded, told everyone the meeting was over, and cleared the room. When the others left, Viscount Langham turned to his guard, McField, asking him softly if the healer's words were true. McField had been watching the whole thing and reported back that there did seem to be a real problem with Chris's core. Viscount Langham tapped his fingers on the table, deep in thought, the sound making McField nervous. It was clear some new plot was brewing in the Viscount's mind. As Viscount Langham pondered, McField wondered what could possibly be coming next. Viscount Langham then muttered about young Master Lion, saying he was supposed to serve as a sacrifice in the upcoming extreme poison mage plan, and everything had gone sideways. The plot to cut out Jupian and Lion at the same time had also crashed. Worse, word was that his own father was starting to take an interest in Chris. Everything was a mess, and it felt like someone was muddying up all his careful schemes. After more tense silence, The Viscount gave McField his order. Bring Chris to the Dark Hall tomorrow so his fate could be judged in front of all the family's retainers. The next scene jumped right to court. Chris stood at the center of the room before Viscount Langham and the most influential members of the family. He could tell from the looks and power in the room that Langham meant business. He had clearly gathered everyone here to make Chris take the fall for everything that happened. Viscount Langham turned solemnly to Chris, asking if he even understood the mistake he made at the sacred dark rite. Chris played it cool but said he did. The Viscount demanded an explanation. Chris answered with a flat face, saying he should have stomped Lion way harder if he wanted to live up to the family's fierce reputation. He'd failed because the others were still walking around. Immediate outrage followed, with some members staring him down and ready to shout at him, but Viscount Langham cut them off. He defined Chris's real mistake. After monopolizing all the family's resources, Chris hadn't brought home any accomplishments worthy of those gifts. Chris pressed him, what did he mean by worthy achievement? Viscount Langham coldly replied, you needed at least 70% purity of the sacred darkness, anything less and you didn't count. Chris asked what happened to someone who fell short of that. Viscount Langham laid down the law. Anyone not absorbing over 70% would be cut off. They would never be taught dark magic again, would be banned from the main house, and would lose any chance at inheriting the family title or future. Chris looked around and asked how exactly they planned to judge his achievement, when it seemed nobody could even measure his results with precision. Before anyone else could butt in, Eshid raised his hand, smirking and calling Chris his little brother in that half-mocking tone. He pointed out that while Chris's core was all cloudy, a good old-fashioned magical collision could at least give a rough estimate of his purity. Eshid declared that if Chris managed to hit 70% and even managed to surpass him, that'd mean Chris had outdone his results and everyone would have to recognize it. Someone explained that magical collision was exactly what it sounded like, a straight-up clash of raw magic where everything came down to purity. If you had equal magic stores, dark magic would crush any other kind of magic. But when two dark mages of the same rank went at it, the winner was always the one with purer darkness. The loser's core usually got wrecked. It was the most gangster way to settle whose magic was better. Chris called Eshid out for being more underhanded than he thought, but decided to go with it anyway. He countered that if he won, if the whole room agreed he succeeded, Viscount Langham should officially recommend him so he could actually take the test to become heir. That shut the room up. Most people looked shocked, and Eshid grinned, saying he liked Chris's idea. Why should it matter if a branch or a direct child went for the top spot? Strength alone should decide, just like the real world outside. Other relatives wondered if Eshid was for real, bringing up the whole way of the heir thing for someone from a branch family. Eshid looked Chris straight in the eye. Serious now. He warned Chris that if they screwed this up even a little, it'd be bad for both of their cores. For the test, Eshid would stick with a safe, second-tier magic, same with Chris rank, but varying in purity. The two of them set up across from one another, both gathering their power and letting it pulse through the room. A thick black aura clashed between them. Chris kept it chill, telling Eshid he didn't need to go so hard. He'd want his precious core intact after this, after all. Eshid replied that Chris sure talked big, but he was curious how Chris's darkness would measure up. As their clash started, Chris upped his dark magic. He pushed out more and more darkness, and soon the collision began to overwhelm everything Eshid threw at him. Chris's magic wrapped around the others and snuffed it out, no matter how much Eshid threw in. Baffled, Eshid blurted out that Chris was neutralizing his magic without even gathering extra energy. Eshid decided it was time for an upgrade, a much bigger, badder spell, a second-tier upper-class magic. But Chris still countered it like it wasn't even a challenge. At this point, Chris realized he could push just a little harder, so he let a real wave of aura pulse out, sending a ripple through the whole hall. Eshid's spell was wiped away again, and Chris couldn't help but sound disappointed. Here Eshid was acting like a big shot, but in reality, he just wasn't impressive. Pushed to his breaking point, Eshid totally snapped. He summoned up a purple vortex, ramping up his aura all the way into fourth-tier territory. Purple energy started spinning like a storm, and the room held its breath. People muttered nervously. If Eshid fired off that level of magic, Chris's core could be shattered for good. The spell took the form of a wild dragon, surging toward Chris with jaws open wide. But Chris had it covered. A giant hand made from his own darkness grew out, stretching and grabbing the dragon out of the air like it was nothing. Eshid looked shocked and defeated. Chris dryly reminded Eshid that when you played with high-tier magic in a test like this, you had to be careful. The damage could be permanent. He stretched his magic even more, pressing it closer to Eshid's dragon. Suddenly, Eshid's spell broke off completely, and he went down coughing blood all over the floor. The hall erupted into chaos. Witnesses yelled for help, realizing this match wasn't a harmless exchange. Chris watched Eshid fall, thinking he almost went too easy. He'd aimed to shatter Eshid's core, but that trash dude can still escape it. Damn. Chris regretted it a little. Bleeding and panting, Eshid admitted his defeat, declaring for everyone that Chris's purity had surpassed 90%. The crowd was floored, and Chris grinned as he asked if this was enough to give him the right to challenge for air. Viscount Langham tapped his finger against the table, thinking it over. As promised, he agreed to let Chris take the test. Still, there was no rule for a branch member going for it, so as provisional head, Viscount Langham said he'd pick the test himself. First, Chris had to prove his talent, and then he'd have to do something extraordinary, pull off a feat worthy of an heir. Chris wanted details, so the Viscount spelled it out. He'd need to reach 3 stars within 3 months. Chris laughed, saying if that was all, there was nothing to worry about. He was a genius, after all. Viscount Langham told him he was looking forward to seeing if Chris could really deliver. Afterward, Eshid sat having tea with Viscount Langham, looking shaken. The Viscount said he was disappointed in Eshid, who could only admit he'd completely underestimated Chris, and the backlash might have even damaged his core. Now he thought they had to do something about Chris before he turned into a genuine threat. But the Viscount was unbothered. He said he doubted Chris would ever make it. The reason nobody went over 70% purity was because every extra drop made it exponentially harder to advance. Even hitting 3 stars would take way longer, no matter how smart Chris was. He felt confident there was no way Chris could climb that mountain in time. Meanwhile, in Chris's own room, Marie was showing off her cooking. She set a steaming plate down and hummed about how news of Chris had flown all over the estate. She gushed about how splendid and captivating he was, saying it made her heart practically burst. Chris, cheeks a little pink, told her not to embarrass him. Marie just smiled sweetly and admitted that while she waited for him, she realized how deep her feelings ran. She missed him every single day, and every moment he was gone felt like forever. Chris was genuinely taken aback by how sincere and warm she sounded, realizing just how much she cared. The scene flashed back to a warmer time, back when he was a hero. There, Lena fussing over Chris, gently asking if he hurt anywhere. Rania, who was watching closely, piped up and said Chris was way too fast to get hurt, but figured she might as well check anyway, just to be sure. Lena shot back that it was odd for Rana to say that, since she was actually the one worrying, but Rana said that wasn't true at all. She claimed it was Evan who was anxious. Chris, seeing their bickering, gave a genuine smile. It had been forever since he felt this peaceful. After escaping that nightmare family where everyone just wanted him gone, and living a past life stained with blood and betrayal at every step, this simple care felt unreal. Evan walked up and placed a comforting hand on Chris's shoulder. Deep inside, Chris knew these warm hearts had helped lead him forward, and all the stuff he never could say back then. This time, he swore he'd do it right. He looked back at Marie and thanked her, which stopped her in her tracks. Then he thanked her again, saying he really meant it this time, for waiting for him. Marie's cheeks went red as she told him he was finally getting it, and her heart was thumping even harder. Chris just snorted, reminding her for the millionth time that she didn't even have a real heart. But Marie just winked, saying that was only true because Chris had already stolen it. The dude could hardly believe how smooth she was with her comebacks. Since she'd waited for him, he promised her a reward, a walk together. Marie lit up, asking if he was for real or just teasing. Chris swore he meant it and said they could leave right away. By the time they strolled into the garden, Marie was positively glowing, and honestly, Chris couldn't help but enjoy himself too. Chris thought aloud about how good it was to chill like this for once, but also how wild the road ahead looked. Reaching 3 stars felt like no joke. Time was tight, and getting help from any branch instructors seemed pointless. Handling 90% purity solo was going to take everything he had. Suddenly, his Aunt Marion's voice cut in, joking that he was still finding ways to stir up trouble. He greeted her, admitting it had been a minute and saying it was good to see her again. Marion pointed out that now wasn't really the moment for a relaxing garden walk and pressed if he'd found a master for training. Chris, a little hopeful, wondered if she meant herself. But Marion shook her head. She wasn't volunteering, but she knew exactly who would help him. She told him to follow her. Chris glanced at Marie, apologizing, and she just smiled, waving him off. Of course, she'd wait. As Marion led Chris down a spiral of halls and stairs, Chris confessed he didn't know who his new master was, but felt grateful Marion found him anyway. Marion only said he shouldn't thank her yet. It was another thing entirely whether he'd appreciate the experience. She mentioned nobody among their siblings had kept up with this guy's training, but for a once-in-a-lifetime chance, Chris better not blow it. They entered a quiet room where, confusingly, a little boy stood waiting all alone. Chris stared and muttered that this had to be a lost kid. He crossed the room and patted the boy on the head, asking where his parents were. The boy looked up at him with such a harsh glare that Chris suddenly put the dots together. Marion explained that Chris should pay his respects. It was none other than the family head's incarnation. Chris stiffened and greeted him properly. The Duke's gaze was sharp as he scanned Chris, black aura visible even to Chris's eyes. The Duke had to admit, Chris had over 90% for sure, and had achieved something massive. Still, the Duke told him, surely he understood how reckless it was. Chris nodded honestly, and the Duke explained even he only took in 80% and hit a wall most could never pass. Without the blessing of the Demon King, even their ancestors wouldn't have managed, and Chris's challenge was even steeper. Then the Duke offered something wild. He could personally revert some of Chris's absorbed dark mana, flat out using his authority to save Chris from his own power. Chris asked if he was allowed to speak his mind, and when the Duke agreed, Chris questioned why the Dark Mage clan kept growing weaker. Marion interrupted, wanting to know what he was trying to say, but Chris doubled down, saying despite all their success under the Duke's leadership, other demons still put them in last place among the 12 great houses. The Duke leaned in, realizing Chris had a point. It all came down to a single reason: they just didn't have anyone past 8 stars anymore. As Chris explained, the last time the Blood Monarch Demon King went after their clan, the legendary Nordian had already died. No 8-star demons, just a handful of 7s. With 10,000 soldiers, they still lost and became servants, proving how important those top-tier beings were. Chris promised he understood the Duke's concern that the darkness might crush any chance of real growth, but he also knew the Duke was wondering if maybe, just maybe, this power would go beyond the limits and be the start of a new era for the clan. The Duke burst out laughing, admitting Chris talked big. He warned Chris not to regret those words, then cast a spell at Chris's feet. The ground opened up, and Chris couldn't do anything but stare as he tumbled downward, landing in the middle of a dark forest. He blinked, disoriented, trying to piece together where he was, only to be told by a mysterious voice that his first task was to inherit dark mana and survive. Then, out of nowhere, a two-headed bear lunged from the shadows. Chris froze, sweat breaking out as he mumbled a nervous, "I'm screwed," not even knowing the half of it. Back in the estate, the Duke and Marion watched his progress through a magic orb. Marion whispered that the trial was overkill, tossing a barely 2-star kid into a den full of grade 4 beasts. The Duke only nodded, deciding one monster wasn't enough, and snapped his fingers, summoning a second beast, a nasty-looking scaly lizard. Marion apologized in her heart for what Chris was about to go through, but the Duke only shrugged. He said that by struggling for his life, Chris would come closer than ever to the heart of dark mana. Sometimes, true power only awakened when faced with death. While Chris was busy running for his life, the Duke casually asked Marion if she'd prepared what he wanted. Marion nodded and opened a covered tray packed with sweets. The Duke started digging in, saying every time he used magic, he craved sugar like crazy, so he'd earned some snacks after all that drama. As the Duke snapped his fingers again, darkness swept over, turning the sky pitch black. He declared with a grin that the best time to watch a show was always at night. He didn't hide his excitement, laughing out loud and saying how pumped he was to see his grandson's special kind of training. Down below, Chris eyed up the two monsters stalking him, a twin-headed bear and a rock lizard. He said to himself that just one hit from those guys would turn his bones to powder. The rock lizard made a loud screech and spat a bolt of acid that Chris barely dodged. The acid sizzled, burning a hole straight through the nearest tree. Chris knew right away that one mistake meant game over. Still, he reminded himself that this was all a training exercise, and he called out, asking if the Duke could hear him. The Duke wondered what his grandson wanted. Chris guessed out loud that the Duke wouldn't throw him into this nightmare without a path to victory somewhere. But Marion was honest. There really wasn't one. Chris had to figure out, somehow, how to beat monsters way above his level. Marion joked it was less about growth and more about the Duke getting fun of seeing him get smacked around. Chris grinned and decided he was all in. This felt like a wild round of Street Fighter. The bear lunged and Chris ducked under it, muttering how fast and strong the monster really was. But as he dodged again and again, he figured there had to be a way to get the upper hand. The Duke, observing through the magical orb, sighed and said Chris definitely had talent. His moves were way beyond what other kids could pull off. Marion agreed, but pointed out that Chris was still just a kid. Next thing they knew, Chris was standing on the corpse of the twin-headed bear, leaving both the Duke and Marion totally shocked. The Duke demanded to know how Chris managed it. Chris explained that despite the bear's huge strength and defense, its agility wasn't great and it was weak to magic. Waiting for just the right opening, he injected dark magic directly into its heart. Marion gasped, recognizing what he'd done, as Simon came strolling up, explaining that the trick was called Dark Death, a classic Duke move. The Duke stayed deep in thought. There was still the rock lizard waiting for Chris, who braced himself, saying now only one challenge remained. The lizard came at him, tail swinging. Chris slid underneath and dodged another acid attack. He studied it, thinking about the 3 hearts made of stone hidden in its body. He knew that it would keep reviving unless he could smash all 3 at the same time. Chris spun up a net of dark aura and whipped it over the lizard, tightening it around the core spots, and crushed the beast to shards in a single motion. Simon jumped with excitement, saying that was another clever use of Dark Death, genuinely impressed. The moment was ruined as Simon leaned in a little too close to the magic orb, blocking the Duke's view. The Duke grumbled at Simon to back up because he couldn't see anything either. The Duke then asked Marion if she'd taught Chris all this, but she shook her head. The Duke said it wasn't possible for anyone to learn that kind of skill so fast anyway. Simon started rambling about how Chris might not even need special dark magic training now. The Duke just shut it down, saying enough was enough and the trial was finished. A magic circle appeared, returning Chris to the place he'd started. The Duke told him he was better than expected. Chris shot back that it was all thanks to him, the master, and that he'd learned a ton about applying dark magic in just that short fight. That nonsense left Marion and Simon speechless, thinking both master and student were a bit crazy. The Duke told him not to get arrogant. Now it was time for the real dark magic lessons. He told Marion and Simon to step out, and Marion looked anxious as she closed the door behind her. Once they were alone, the Duke got serious. He wanted Chris to start his training by answering, "What is dark magic?" Chris answered confidently. It was the power to control opponents with perfect darkness. The Duke challenged him. What did perfect darkness even mean? Chris hesitated, thinking it over. Without much warning, the Duke told him to watch carefully as he began to unlock a sealed power. The whole room shook, magical energy crackling at their feet. The Duke enchanting, "For all darkness resides there." Chris's senses exploded as the world around him warped with bursts of colors. Walk and walk again. As you descend the deep stairs, 12 abysses shall await. The Duke continued. Black, purple, blue, and a bunch of shimmering shapes emerging. At the center of it all, a weapon formed. The Duke grasped it, then thrust it toward Chris with furious speed. Chris actually felt the force cut through the air. Cracks had ripped through the very fabric of reality behind him. He reached for his throat, shocked, because it had felt like the blade slashed right through his neck like it was paper. The Duke calmly announced that this was a conceptual blade. It cut only what it wanted to slice through. This was the ultimate force the black sword held, shaped entirely by dark magic. He dispelled the weapon and told Chris he had 1 month. If Chris could grasp the black sword for himself, they'd keep going with his training. With that, the Duke strode away and left Chris standing there in stunned silence, totally unable to process what had just happened. A week passed by. Chris then practiced and ran alone. He took off his shirt and hoped his body would now be full of muscles, but in reality his body was still very skinny and he thought he needed to eat much more. After that, he began to focus again and unleashed all his abilities to form a dark sword. He muttered to himself that this was not easy as expected. He wondered how many times he had tried now. Even if he succeeded in summoning the sword, it was hard to hold it for more than 10 seconds. Plus, this didn't even come close to matching the powerful, primal darkness from the black sword the Duke had shown him. He kept grinding, repeating the strange incantation in his mind. As you descend the deep stairs, 12 abysses shall await. O crow who seeks wisdom, accept it, praise it. Chris felt there had to be some secret wrapped up in those words. 1 month later, the Duke walked toward Chris's training ground while chatting with Marion. He told Marion that with this much practice, Chris should have learned his limits after failing so many times. He asked if Marion was still that worried. Marion answered by asking if there was a faster way. Marion explained there were only 2 months left until the Confucian exam. The Duke explained that with the purity of the dark magic Chris had obtained from the rite, rapid growth was impossible. Even if they rushed ahead, they would just hit a huge wall. It was more important to build a solid foundation, so rather than the Confucian exam, they need to guide Chris to learn what dark magic is first. However, when they arrived at the training ground, the Duke could only stare in shock. In front of him, Chris was greeting him with a dark sword in his hand. Chris greeted him, saying that the head of the family had arrived and that he thought it was about time he would show up. Everyone there was shocked and could not believe seeing that sword. Is this even real? Chris thanked the family head, saying that thanks to his teachings, he was able to reach the 3rd tier faster than expected. He admitted that as the Duke could see, it was still just an imitation at best. Of course, it took about a week to manifest the black sword, but he thought it was just the surface. He mentioned the enigmatic incantation the Duke had shared then, the 12 abysses. He asked if it was important to imbue all the magic attributes into the black sword, right? The Duke witnessed all this and could only be slightly shocked and sweat. He thought about our crafty MC and the true black sword. Not only had Chris overturned expectations, but had he even properly grasped the intent behind the task? To implement a basic black sword would take at least a year. And to comprehend the 12 magics and awaken the true black sword, a lifetime might not be enough. Chris really did manage to create it in just a month. This talent this guy has is truly beyond human comprehension. Could this be a glimmer of hope found at the end of forbidden magic? The Duke then smiled. Seeing this, Marion could not believe seeing the Duke smile like that after such a long time of never witnessing it. The Duke told Chris to be prepared starting tomorrow, as the teachings he would give from now on would not be easy. He then left, leaving Chris behind. Hearing this, Chris just smiled brightly and said it was okay because he trusted the Duke's guidance. He thought to himself with excitement that he had passed one hurdle, so maybe he should celebrate today. He then went to a place that had lots of alcohol. He exclaimed with joy that this was some good luck, and that he was drinking expensive liquor there that he could never afford before in his past life. Especially, he needed to drink where Mary would not see him. While Chris was trying to sneak around in that place, someone called him. The voice said it was Christian, drinking in the middle of the day as usual. Seeing that there was a woman, Chris thought hard about who she was. She was clearly a 3rd-tier mage. Judging by her eye color, she was probably not a practitioner of dark magic. With a dumb face, he asked if he knew her. Hearing this, the woman became very shocked and extremely upset. She stammered and called him a little jerk before slapping Chris so hard that he fell to the ground. The woman's guard restrained her, telling the princess to please go and that there was no need to concern herself over such trash. Watching those two leave, Chris just became annoyed. He wondered what that was about and how ridiculous it was. Who did she think she was, acting so rude all of a sudden? Suddenly, one of the instructors who had previously brought him to the place where the rite ritual took place, explained while taking the alcohol from Chris's hand that the woman was Princess Marisa of the Extreme Poison Mage. Hearing that name mentioned, Chris became shocked. He wondered if she was the Extreme Poison Mage, and could she be his fiancée? The instructor clarified that to be precise, she was his ex-fiancée. With that, Chris realized this had just gotten complicated. Marisa walked away from Chris when suddenly she remembered her past. She was 8 years old back then. When she was still a child, she found herself in the middle of a gathering of aristocrats at her mansion. She complained that she was bored because everyone was just going to talk to her brother anyway. She wondered why her dad had brought her to the Extreme Poison Mage estate if it was going to be like this. Suddenly, someone looked at her direction and spoke about her being the girl and illegitimate child. They wondered if Duke Huam had suddenly gone mad or something. Since his son was useless, now he needed a daughter to marry off and secure a son-in-law, right? Hearing that, Marisa just stayed silent and tried to control her feelings. However, suddenly Mini Chris came over to her with his somewhat playboy style. He asked what she was doing there all alone, calling her kid. She protested that she was not a kid but Marisa. He acknowledged her and introduced himself as Christian. Chris explained that she should not mind what the grown-ups said. She should just pay them back once she grew up. He smiled and asked if she got it. Guys, please drop a comment. Do you think Chris as children is kind, or he just tried to riz this girl? Back to story, Marisa, who was a bit shy, answered that she would. She declared that she would become the strongest demon practitioner and make them all eat their words. Hearing that, Chris just smiled and said that she had ambition. That was the spirit, just what he would expect from someone of the Extreme Poison Mage line. Since she was going to be the strongest, he better stayed on her good side. He called her the future strongest demon practitioner. After that, Chris extended his hand to Marisa, who was crouching while holding her doll, and asked if she would do him the honor of allowing him to show her around the Extreme Poison Mage estate. Since that moment, Marisa began to like Chris. However, she quickly shook her head and thought everything was in the past. She reflected that even if it was an engagement arranged for the sake of peace between their houses, she once lost sleep dreaming of the future they might share. The foolish version of herself was gone now. Marissa then entered the room where Viscount Langham was located. He welcomed Lady Marissa, saying it had been a while. She greeted him as Marquis, and he asked what brought her there. Marissa explained that as he was aware, a relic had recently appeared in the neutral zone between their two houses. The Viscount glanced toward her and asked flatly what the extreme poison mage planned to do about it. Since they took the last relic, were they planning to concede this one? Hearing all that, Marissa was not intimidated and even smiled. She said that would not be happening and asked if he would have done that if their positions were reversed. When the Viscount asked if she was proposing a fair contest for it, Marissa explained that was correct. Each house would send an expedition, and whoever found it first got to keep it. However, she proposed each expedition team be limited to 10 demon practitioners of rank 3 stars or lower. The Viscount understood this was to avoid a direct clash between the houses. Marissa confirmed it was correct. If they shed too much blood, it would only benefit their enemies, especially since the political climate around the Four Kings Star had become so unstable. The Viscount considered everything and said that was very well. He accepted the conditions. Hearing the Viscount's answer, Marissa became suspicious. That was surprisingly easy, and suspiciously so. The Viscount then explained that, however, he had one additional condition. If the extreme poison mage broke the agreement, then not only would the current relic default to the Marquisate, but so would the one they obtained recently. When she asked about the meaning of breaking the rule, the Viscount explained that it included sabotaging their team with underhanded tactics, for instance. Traps and ambushes were the extreme poison mage specialty, after all. Hearing all that nonsense, Marissa tried to contain her anger. She said that would not happen, and accepted his additional condition. The Viscount asked if she would be leading the extreme poison mage expedition team herself. Marissa answered that was the plan. The Viscount said then they would get to witness the famed might of the lesser 10,000 poisons. He would be looking forward to it. Feeling disgusted after hearing all those insults, Marissa then bowed her head and said goodbye. In that case, they would await Viscount's team on the day of the expedition. After Marissa left, suddenly the Viscount stood up from his seat and walked toward the chess table that was there. He then took the Black King and knocked down the Queen and the horse that were there while mentioning Marissa and Jupian. He said a beautiful stage would be set, one filled with screams. He performed checkmate on the chessboard and said all that with a terrifying expression.
2 months had passed, and now, the weather was changing, leaves were falling, so everyone knew a new season was starting. And you know what? Chris was working really hard these days, doing his training like a total champ. But he was not the only one changing. Lots of people around him were acting a little different now. Like Marissa, troubled by her past love. Somewhere else, a guy just stood by the window thinking hard about something. His siblings, thinking about their own power. And someone, nobody really knew who, walked under the shadows, sneaking through dark alleys at night. That looked kind of shady. Later, inside a big fancy hall, Chris stood with a group of dudes. Viscount Langham was the boss of these guys. He looked at Chris and told him that now was the time to show if he was really good enough. Chris got ready, and suddenly, a dark purple energy appeared around him. That looked pretty wild, and Langham's men totally freaked out. The guy thought Chris was about to use the dark sword. Chris just smirked, like he was happy to surprise everyone. To him, everyone's face was pretty funny to watch. Chris also remembered some advice from the Duke. The Duke told him not to show his real power in front of Langham, because Langham might make things even harder next time. He said Chris should not let Langham know he got special training. So, Chris decided to hold back a little. He just smiled, acting like nothing big was happening. Langham said he was okay with Chris's skills, but there was a second test. He said agents would soon be searching for a special relic in the neutral zone. The craziest part? Even the powerful ultimate poison dark magic family wanted it. Langham said that if Chris helped find this relic, he would acknowledge him as a real heir. Chris thought this job sounded easier than he expected, but he wanted to know if he could go alone. Langham said nope. Chris had to join a unit led by Princess Yuvian. He told Chris this mission was supposed to be for Rowan, but now Chris could take the shot. He acted like this was a big honor for a nobody like our MC. Chris just accepted and left the room, but Langham watched him with a sneaky, evil smile. One guy said he was worried Chris might mess up, yet Langham told him not to worry. He said everything would go as planned. Later, Chris took a walk outside in the garden. He was thinking a lot. He wondered why the mission seemed easier than he thought. He also remembered that this job used to belong to Rowan. Chris thought about the past, because originally, Rowan was supposed to become the new heir, not him. But nobody ever said much about what happened to Rowan during the big war. Then, he remembered the conversation between him and one of his past friends. His companion, in the fox body, said that if Chris wanted answers he better keep petting him. If he stopped, he wouldn't hear any secrets. The fox started to spill some serious tea. They talked about an old event called the Devil's Relic Incident. There was a big fight between the Dark Mage House and the Ultimate Poison Dark Magic House. Not many people knew about what really happened, but the fox said the Dark Mage House got wiped out while searching for the relic. The other family lost some people too, but both sides tried to hide what happened. The fox said that this incident actually caused bigger problems later. The biggest thing? This event became the seed of disaster. After the incident, the Dark Mage Duke died, and it was Langham's son who did it. Because of that, the Demon King of Evil Blood took over the Dark Mage family super easily. The fox said that this was the real reason everything started to crash down. Chris had to ask why this all mattered. The fox made it clear the Duke's death changed everything. Chris thought about this. He realized that since the Dark Mage's house representative was killed in this event before, maybe now he was in danger instead of Rowan. He guessed that Langham's so-called test was actually a sneaky plan to put him in real danger. But since he didn't have proof, Chris knew he couldn't act too quickly. He was only at 3rd level mastery, so he was not the strongest yet. Still, he thought it was smart to be prepared for trouble. He then decided to step outside. As he tried to leave, Juvian suddenly appeared and blocked his way. She called him a scoundrel and wanted to know where he was going. Chris asked her if it really mattered. Juvian said she heard he was joining the expedition. She just wanted to make sure the job was done since that was supposed to be Rowan's mission. So, Chris playfully guessed Juvian wanted him to stay out of it. He then stated that Langham only picked him because he did not trust Rowan with the responsibility. Hearing that, Juvian was super angry now. She even threw a bladed weapon at Chris. But Chris was super chill about it. He just moved 1 inch of his neck and dodged her attack like it was nothing. Looking at that, Juvian lost her words. Chris then decided this was enough drama for one day. He told Juvian that they probably didn't like each other anyway, so he would not bother her until the real mission started. He said he was off to do something else, and even wished her good luck with her own prep work. Classy move, bro. Chris walked away, acting cool. Meanwhile, Juvian stood alone, taking back the weapon she just tossed. Inside, she thought Chris was dangerous because he didn't even blink when she attacked. She realized he knew she would not hurt him for real. Deep down, she thought Christian was way more dangerous than she guessed. In the village outside the Dark Mage family's home, things were busy. Chris walked through the market, where people shouted and sold stuff everywhere. Bro, this place was lively. Our MC tried his luck with gambling, and of course, he wiped out the other people's money so easily. But hey, he still got himself some tasty grilled meat on a stick, and he looked pretty happy about it. He thought life would be great if he could just eat and play forever. As he was eating and chilling, he noticed something strange. There was a shadowy person following him in the alley. The dudes looked like Langham's goons. They were probably spying on him. That was kind of annoying. He also remembered that the guy's shop was supposed to be close by, so maybe he should deal with the spy first. Suddenly, a hooded figure reached out, grabbed Chris from behind, and covered his mouth. Dang, that was a jump scare. Chris tried to call out, but the person just told him to be quiet and pulled him into a dark alley. Inside the alley, the hooded person pushed Chris against a wall. Chris was totally shocked. He wondered who she was. The person pulled down her hood. It was a woman Chris had never seen before. She told him that someone had been following him, but her own people had already taken care of them. Chris looked over and saw those guys knocked out on the ground, just sleeping like babies. He complained that her way of keeping him safe was a bit much. He wanted to know who in the world she really was. The girl said she was someone who wanted to stop all the creepy, dangerous stuff spreading around the Evil King Castle. When Chris heard the name Evil King Castle, he felt like this was a big deal. The girl said things were getting worse every day. People from the Evil King Castle were vanishing, and all the safe places were being destroyed. She said that the Evil King Castle was caught up in fighting between 3 families, and all their leaders didn't care about their people. That was why she decided to get help from several families to stop the criminals, but she needed to offer something in exchange. She then turned to face him and said she had information that could help his family. She revealed that Marquis Langham was working with an important person from the Ultimate Poison Dark Magic family. Their plan? They wanted to kill Marisa, the daughter of the Ultimate Poison Dark Magic family. Chris, in his head, couldn't believe it. He thought that not only were they targeting his group but also Marisa. He did not understand why they wanted to do that. Sounded crazy. The girl explained that if these evil plans worked, both families would fall apart. Then the real big bosses of the Evil King Castle would become even more powerful, and the balance between the 12 Dark Mage families would be ruined. That would mean disaster for everybody. The girl then faced Chris with a serious look. Chris looked kind of out of it for a minute. She said she hoped Chris was ready for the relic-seeking mission. She also hoped that he would become the young lord of his family and protect the peace someday. Chris guessed that if the girl knew he was there for the relic, her information network must be pretty good. But still, he did not trust her yet. Chris told her she needed to give him something as a guarantee if she really wanted his help. No proof, no trust, that was his style. The girl got flustered and didn't know what to say. Chris teased her a bit, saying she had nothing, but the girl quickly pulled out something shining from her cloak and handed it to him. Bro, our MC tricked someone again. After that, Chris said goodbye and left. Now alone, she looks pretty moody. She wondered why she couldn't show her real self to Christian. A mysterious shadow looked at her on the wall and answered, saying it was for her own safety. If Christian got into danger and said her name, things could get way worse for everyone. The girl agreed. Then, the girl's gray hair suddenly became red, and the shadow revealed her name, Idrine. It keeps saying everything was for her sake. In the end, Idrine said she understood, and they decided to wait and see what would happen. Back in the market, Chris is super excited. We can see how smug his face is. He checked out the VIP card the girl gave him earlier. He felt lucky. Just when he needed this, he got it. He remembered his past life, when he and his buddies could never get into the dark auction house because they didn't have these special cards. This card could change everything. Chris then read the name on the card, Leah de Bolfman. He realized he had never heard of her. He decided he still couldn't trust her fully, so it was better to prepare just in case. He then walked up to a stall to send a message. The shopkeeper told him he could write right there, so Chris wrote a note and sent it away on a big owl bird. He grinned to himself, knowing step 1 of his plan was done. He felt pumped. Now, he was ready to find that guy he wanted to meet. Now, Chris walked right up to a huge, fancy building called the Dark Auction House. This place looked super rich, like something only important people could enter. At the front door, a tough guard blocked Chris. The guard told Chris to buzz off, because this place wasn't for him. But Chris was not worried, bro. He wore a cool white and gold mask and showed his shiny VVIP card. When the guard saw that card, his face changed real quick. He freaked out and suddenly acted super polite, calling Chris a VVIP. Every guard started bowing to him and telling him to come inside. Inside the auction house, Chris entered a giant hall. It was totally decked out, gold, lights, rich people everywhere. An employee, who had elf ears and looked kind of nervous, ran over to speak with Chris. The employee asked if he was maybe Leah de Bolfman. Chris just said, yep, he was Leah de Bolfman today. If there was a problem, he didn't care. He asked the elf to take him to the branch manager, and made sure the message was clear by saying it again with a scary smile. The employee looked terrified, and agreed right away. Soon, Chris chilled out in a super fancy private room, like a real boss. The nervous employee said he'd go get the branch manager. Chris thought to himself that everything here was top class, just like he expected from the famous Rudolph Merchant Group. The Rudolph Merchant Group was a giant company. They worked with another big group called the Union Deer Merchant Group. Basically, these two groups controlled almost all the trading in the dark magic empire. Even said that if Rudolph Merchant Group couldn't get something for you, then probably nobody could. Finally, the branch manager came in. His name was Ruvid, and he was the boss of the auction house and the Rudolph Merchant Group here. He asked Chris if he wanted something special. Chris said he wanted Ruina. Ruvid got super confused and asked if Chris really knew Ruina. Chris teased that he did know, and even hinted that Ruina was already there in the room. Then things got wild. Ruvid's disguise started to fade. He had been using a magic trick to look like a man, but Chris caught him easily. Ruvid, now becoming her real self as Ruina, was shocked that Chris figured it out. Chris, in his own thoughts, remembered that Ruina had caused him lots of trouble in his past life. He decided she deserved to get hustled a little in this life as a return. To answer her question, our boy just answered that she was using such a trashy relic. Of course, he could see the trick right away. He teased that the camouflage was so bad it didn't even cover Ruina's big face. Ruina was mad. Bro, trust me, never say that to a girl's face or you will get instant anger. Anyway, Chris pointed out that he was not really Leah de Bolfman, and Ruina definitely knew that. But he said Ruina shouldn't talk too much, even warned that he might spread rumors about her shady business if she didn't cooperate. Ruina was nervous now. She wanted to know what Chris wanted from her. Now we are talking, and Chris only showed his famous smug face. In the end, she just agreed to help and said he would go prepare what Chris needed. Later, Chris held up a sack of gold and jewels he got from Ruina. Yep, he totally hustled her. He said this was just enough for the drug ingredients he needed and that everyone should be thankful because he was trying to stop destruction. In his mind, he knew this plan wouldn't make him crazy powerful, but it should help beat a couple of the sneaky plans that Langham had for him. That dude was always plotting, so Chris wanted to keep up. Later that night, Chris went to a training ground where a bunch of knights were working out and swinging swords. Jupian shouted that Chris should come and join the training. Yet our boy just waved her off. He was tired from his own plans and said he wasn't interested in fighting or being a soldier like her. Chris wished her good luck with their training, then just walked away like a boss. Hearing that, Rowan got mad and called Chris a little punk, but the Jupian told him to chill out and leave Chris alone. He figured Chris would fall behind anyway, since he wasn't building up any big achievements. In her own mind, Jupian wondered why Chris was acting so stupid. The next day, Chris came back to the merchant group, finishing up his business with Rowena. Rowena gave him a box filled with herbs and asked where Chris planned to use all of them. Our boy just said he had no idea, acting mysterious as always. Then Rowena slid a wooden chest to him. Inside, Chris found a golden frog and a black cloth with patterns on it. He thought these were weird and not fancy at all, but right now, he couldn't be picky. Then, Rowena walked to the door and reminded Chris that he wanted to keep her secret, especially after giving him all that stuff. Chris promised to keep the secret, although Rowena said she didn't really want to see him ever again. But Chris is smug again and stated the war might be coming soon. Rowena was shocked. Chris said that if both the Union and the Magic Empire moved their armies, the whole continent could get dragged into war. He explained that if war started, the big trade routes could be blocked, and merchant, either the Union or the Dark Magic Empire, would lose badly. Rowena understood that half her business could be lost. Rowena said it was a little dramatic. War was not something people started for fun, right? But Chris argued that with all the rumors from the capital city, maybe war wasn't a crazy idea at all. She then checked a document and sighed. Deep down, she secretly agreed. Even in the capital, a lot of noble families were talking about war from the document. She then wanted to know why Chris was telling him all this. Chris joked that maybe Rowena should become his sponsor if she wanted to protect her money. Chris said he was trying to make a future where no war would start. Rowena was confused, but Chris explained some more. He said everyone had to pass through the Southern Wizard Tower, and if Chris became the Duke, he could prepare and stop the worst stuff from happening, and that would also save Rowena's profits. Chris wanted an answer. Was she in or not? He held out his hand for a shake. Rowena looked into Chris's eyes and saw that he was being serious. Inside, she thought this was not such a bad idea, so she agreed. But she warned Chris, if he lied even once, she would walk away. Our MC told her not to worry and waved goodbye, calling Rowena Mr. Moneybag. Rowena was mad, but Chris just laughed. Boys sure have many ways to tease people. Later, Chris was back in his room, grinding the herbs he got earlier. He thought he should make an antidote, just in case, because someone from the ultimate poison dark magic family might cause trouble. He didn't know if the medicine would work well, since it had been a long time since he made any. Then Chris started remembering his past life. He saw images in his mind. Someone thought Chris was just a brat, telling him he was not working fast enough with the medicine. The one saying all of that was a woman named Floral. She was the leader of the famous renowned medical clan. She told Chris to fan the flames better, saying her clan was the best at using fire. Our boy just sighed, thinking Floral was already complaining a lot. He then remembered how he first met Floral on a battlefield during the First War. Her clan was attacked by the Demon King Evil Blood. The whole medical clan was almost wiped out, and she had to fight as a leader, even though she was young. The Demon King didn't want any medical clan to stay alive because it was probably a threat. Floral ended up weak, coughing up blood, but she stayed alive thanks to Chris's medicine. She trusted Chris and gave him a book with the secret techniques of her clan. Even though the book was not complete, she asked him to save suffering people for her, so she could rest in peace. Chris said it was okay to call him her student now. Floral smiled, even though she was sick, and said she had picked the right student. The flashback showed Chris standing alone in a field full of flowers. After Floral died, Chris became the 27th head of the medical clan, and was called the Saint on the Battlefield, because he helped so many people. He remembered he did all that to keep his promise to his master, Floral. Now, in the present, Chris looked at a small round pill and thought about his master. He hoped she was living well in this new life too. Chris promised to keep his word for her, no matter what. Far away, the messenger bird Chris sent was flying through the sky, headed toward a place that looked like a giant castle. At the Marquis's estate, a servant brought a letter from Chris to the Marquis. The Marquis was super excited. Finally, some news from his son. He started reading the letter and thought to himself that Chris was just as strong as his mom, Marion. He wondered, though, what Chris actually wrote in the letter. As he kept reading, the Marquis's happy face turned serious. He quickly called for the servant and said that it was time to start making preparations for his son. Looks like something big was about to happen next. Now, the time for the mission has come. The Dark Mage family's expedition team stood in a foggy forest, looking kind of nervous. The team leader, Jupian, told everyone that no one could do things alone and everybody had to stick together in groups, at least 2 people. The team agreed like good students. But, of course, there was always that one guy. Chris told everyone that he wanted to go alone. Jupian looked shocked, like, dude, what? Our boy said he just felt more comfortable by himself. Why the group was moving around like a bunch of clumsy bugs, and he worried that the whole lot would be beaten by the ultimate poison magic. Chris didn't want to let the enemy ambush them first. Jupian reminded him that they were in a spot where scary demonic beasts like to hang out. These monsters were at least grade 4, so no one should expect a rescue if things went south. She threw out another warning about not getting himself caught. And of course, our boy don't give a fuck. Then he gave her a bag of pills. He told her that it was an antidote for the poison from the ultimate poison dark magic family. Chris said he already took it, so they could just use this one. Jupian almost said she didn't want it, but Chris mocked her. So, in the end, she took that pill away to shut fucking Chris's mouth. Up ahead in a clearing, the ultimate poison dark magic family showed up with Marisa leading them. She wondered if there was already drama in the group. Jupian noticed that Marisa's team was kind of late, but Marisa snapped back, saying she was right on time and called her impatient. She said at least Jupian didn't cause trouble, and then she reminded everyone about the rules. Don't sabotage or ambush the other teams during the mission. Jupian showed off that she knew the rules, and Marisa seemed annoyed, saying she was their enemy but also kind of just tired of talking to her. And now, everyone started getting ready to explore. Marisa's team confirmed that they were ready, and her people started moving out. Jupian watched them go, then said that maybe she should go too. But bro, Chris had his own plan. He broke away from his team, running off by himself, totally ignoring the orders. He even tossed his communication device on the ground. Like, who even needs that stuff, right? Jupian saw this and thought Chris was acting crazy. Like, why ditch the device? Deep in the woods, our boy was already fighting a wild demonic beast, making it look easy. He thought to himself that he had been through so many demon realms in his old life, he could find a demon beast's weak spot with his eyes closed. For a grade 4 beast, he knew exactly where to strike. He suddenly remembered Jupian. He started thinking if maybe, just maybe, she had been worried about him. But nah, he didn't really believe it, since that cold-blooded Jupian never acted soft. Anyway, he kept going alone through the creepy forest. He was suspicious because he knew a plan to take down Marisa must already be starting, but there wasn't any obvious ambush yet. He thought it was better to start gathering intel first, but then, he spotted Marisa far away. They spotted each other and locked eyes. Chris realized he had wandered right onto the ultimate poison dark magic family's path, which was a big oops. He apologized, kind of, saying he messed up and would leave. Marisa told him to be careful, acting a bit cooler than before. But Chris started putting the pieces together in his head, that the real plan was to hurt Marisa. He wondered who the big boss behind all this was and if they were trying to sacrifice Marisa. He then decided to ask Marisa a question and called out to her. He wanted to know if maybe her family hated her. Hearing that, Marisa got hurt and angry. Her face went red. She basically told Chris that he was the worst. Chris felt a little bad for being nosy. He thought that in his old life, he never understood people from noble families, and maybe he had judged Marisa wrong. Suddenly, Marisa freaked out more and fired a poisonous magic needle at Chris. It zipped past his face and hit a tree, making it sizzle. Now that was some scary stuff, bro. She demanded that Chris apologize properly, and Chris, seeing how mad she was, realized it maybe wasn't a family drama after all. He decided he had to find out who set the trap, because, until then, that crazy person was a threat. Even if Marisa's team worked with the expedition, he didn't trust that anyone would actually survive. He figured he just needed to stall for time until help arrived. Chris then pointed out that Marisa was breaking the rules right now. Marisa got all riled up and wanted to know what he meant. Our MC said the proof was the tree. She had made the first attack, so now the Dark Mage family would get the relic. Marisa denied it, but she also said Chris also insulted her family and, thinking about her pain from when Chris broke their engagement, she saw it as self-defense. Then, Marisa went beast mode and released a huge cloud of blue and purple poison magic right at Chris. He was surrounded by poison, and he started coughing. But then the girl asked him how he liked her blue flower magic. She bragged that if she snapped her fingers, the poison would shoot into Chris's veins. She told him to apologize or even beg for his life. But even when the poison filled the air, Chris just stood there like a boss. He didn't even get hurt. When Marisa tried to snap her fingers, Chris caught her wrist before she did anything. He told her that her trick wouldn't work on him. Dang, bro, Chris was on a whole other level. Marisa was shocked, big time. She could not believe it. She was super sure she was the only one who had the antidote for that poison. But Chris, being the weird genius he was, started talking about something called a physician's oath. He told her he made his own version, calling it perfect detox pills. He seemed pretty proud of it, even if Marisa thought he was just talking nonsense. But damn, suddenly, the poor Marisa got knocked out by Chris, and she fainted right there. He caught her before she could hit the ground and told her to just chill for a bit. He promised himself that he would save her, no matter what. After that, Marisa was tied to a tree. Yeah, Chris tied her up, but it was for her own safety kinda. Our nonchalant boy stood near her, playing with this glowing orb that let him copy people's voices. He used the orb to sound like Marisa and told her team that she wanted them to explore the cliff. Her teammates were so confused, but Chris just laughed to himself, thinking there was no way he'd run into the ultimate poison dark magic family right now. He then started rushing through the forest, thinking big. He remembered that relics, those super rare powerful items made by demons or saints, would sometimes just fall out of the sky for the creatures of Earth to fight over. The new relic today was supposed to be the Amulet of Twilight, and according to Lena the Chatterbox of Darkness, its power was a mystery. Some guy called Marquis Langham found a way to use it after a ton of research, and because of that, the head of the family dies. Chris didn't want Nordione to die, because someone had to slow down the end of the world, so he needs to get that relic first. Chris landed and saw some weird footprints on the ground. He thought it was wild because, bro, humans couldn't survive in this demon realm, so what was going on? Relics didn't have feet. He cast an invisibility spell and tracked the footsteps. A little farther away, he could see one villain hanging out with two mysterious cloaked goons. They found the relic box and were waiting for someone. Chris zipped by, watching and listening in. He could sense from their powers that these people were definitely from the ultimate poison dark magic family. One was strong, like 4-star level. The female mage there was even stronger, maybe 5-star. But the villain seemed different. He didn't even have the right vibes to fit in. The blue-haired man was grumpy, annoyed with Marisa for messing up the job and hoping that she would just drop dead. Chris figured this man was probably a direct descendant of that poison family. They talked about erasing everyone in their way and just taking the relic. The man said he was planning to give it to Viscount Langham after taking care of Marisa, but now he didn't care what it was. He just wanted it done. He sent his goons to find out where the girl was. Now the blue-haired guy was left alone. Our boy started plotting. He wondered if he should try and fight that guy head-on, or maybe just take him out quietly. But while he was thinking, he looked at the tree and found something amusing. Now, the villain man is sitting and yawning, but something super gross happened. Some poop started dripping on his head. He looked up and, dude, there were demonic monkeys in the tree above. Suddenly, the monkeys started going wild, screeching, and attacking him. The blue-haired villain was freaking out, yelling at the monkeys and trying to battle them while they climbed all over him. Chris just smiled, totally undetected, and controlled the monkey, then straight up stole the real relic box while all the chaos was going on. He thought it might be fun to mess with these guys a little more. He then took out a necklace, a magic storage. He never knew he would use this necklace just for messing with a villain, since it could even store a 4-star demonic beast. He then summoned the storage and put the relic box inside. He then pulled out the fake relic from Ruina and swapped it. Now, the bad guys would only find the fake pretty sneaky, right? Chris then walked away, finally opened the real relic, ready to see the mighty Amulet of Twilight. But then, his face just fell. He stared in shock, because inside there wasn't any fancy amulet, nope. Instead there was just a pretty fancy blue and gold garter. Meanwhile, Marisa woke up feeling like crap. She found herself tied to a tree and remembered Chris holding her after she passed out. She got super mad, yelling in her head that Chris was a useless brat who should just get lost. Then suddenly, a woman with light brown hair named Melon showed up in front of her. Melon asked if Marisa was the lady from the ultimate poison dark magic family. Marisa was confused and fired back, wanting to know who this stranger was. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the forest, the Dark Mage family expedition team was still searching for the relic. Jupian had that antidote Chris gave him, but she still didn't trust it. She was thinking to herself, like, why would I believe anything from that guy anyway? Some team members were calling out, but nobody had found anything good. Rowan thought, hey, is Chris really going to be okay out there on his own? But Jupian acted tough and told herself she wasn't worried. She said if Chris wanted to go solo and got himself killed, that was on him. Right then, another teammate came running up, holding what looked like the relic box. Everyone was excited. Jupian thought the mission was finally done, and she was glad they found the relic, even though we know it's fake. Before the ultimate poison dark magic family, she told everyone to send a message to meet at the Lacus meeting spot. Rowan shouted the orders, and everyone got ready to leave, feeling pretty proud of themselves. But on the way through a narrow canyon, the team got chatty. One dude was all, "We beat the other family, right?" Someone else wondered if Chris had maybe died, which was pretty dark. Rowan offered to go check. But Jupian told teams 1 and 2 to stay behind and search for Chris, because, even if he was useless, he was still part of the family. Without him, even just his body, they would look bad. Suddenly, things went bonkers. The canyon began to collapse. Rocks tumbled down, blocking the exits. Then, green poison gas and blue smoke came leaking from the cracks. Jupian yelled that it was an ambush. Team members started coughing and collapsing. Up above, a female assassin and her hooded buddies stood on the cliff, looking real evil. The assassin said it was all over. She explained that the blue poison was called Blue Flower, created by Marisa herself, so everyone would blame Marisa for what happened. She knew it was risky to attack the Dark Mage family out in the open, but if they wanted to wipe out everyone in one shot, this was the fastest way. She wondered if she should be taking the relic back to Marisa's lab to make her look like the real killer. But suddenly, someone threw a dagger at her, and she had to block it. Turns out, the Dark Mage family's team wasn't totally dead. They started getting up. Jupian, still coughing, said she recognized the attackers as the ultimate poison dark magic family. She yelled that this was totally breaking the rules. The other team members still felt super dizzy though. The assassin couldn't believe they survived the poison. That stuff should have been impossible to cure. Jupian wondered out loud if the medicine Chris gave her had saved the team. She started to think maybe Chris wasn't such a jerk after all. The assassin decided she would have to do the job herself and jumped down to fight Jupian. But Jupian wasn't backing down, she yelled right back. But sadly, the assassin was just too strong and quickly overpowered her. As the assassin got ready to finish off Jupian, a bunch of throwing needles suddenly stopped her. Melon and Marisa appeared like heroes, ready to rumble. Melon called out to Marisa, acting a bit cheeky, but Marisa wasn't interested in small talk. She then looked at the assassin and demanded to know why she was using her special blue flower poison and asked for her name and who sent her. The assassin just smirked and asked, so Marisa still had no idea what was happening. She then called out her backup. A fight broke out. Melon realized that the enemy team was super strong, with 2 3-star dark mages and a 4-star boss, way stronger than their own crew. She knew the enemy must have done their homework, figuring out the dark mage family didn't have any super high-level fighters with them. Jupian was freaking out at this point, thinking this was how they were all going to die. But then they heard a smug voice from up high. Who was it? Of course, it was Chris. He was standing on a cliff above the whole mess, looking super cool and maybe a little too relaxed, saying it was an incredible coincidence that everyone happened to meet here right now. Marisa and Jupian both saw him and just blurted out shocked, "Christian? Yeah, bro always knew how to make the dopest entrance." Looking down at everybody fighting below, he said to everyone that they must have really missed him. But right away, Marisa and Jupian totally disagreed. Marisa even told Chris that he needed to talk to her later, but she sounded pretty mad. Just then, the female assassin laughed at the group. She thought everyone below was doomed, and said that just because another useless guy showed up, they did not really have a chance. That comment kind of annoyed Marisa, but she had to admit that it was true. She thought to herself that when fighters reached the level of 5 stars, they changed a lot, like they turned into something new and dangerous. Even if their whole group worked together, it probably would not be enough to stop this enemy. The assassin started acting full of herself, thinking that her star rank made her better than everyone else. But then, something unexpected happened. Chris called the enemy's plan sloppy and threw 2 shiny relics down to his friends. Marisa caught a golden frog tied to a green ribbon, and Melon grabbed a sparkly necklace, and Jupian grabbed some weird necklace thing. Ah, I remember those things were from Ruina. Everyone looked at the items, super confused. Marisa wondered what the heck this thing even was. Chris said, well, he kind of bragged, that it was a relic that boosted a person's power 1 level at a time. Jupian instantly put the relic on, and bam! She felt a huge burst of purple energy inside her. She tried to act cool and said she definitely did not like this thing, but everyone could see the relic had hit her like a truck. Marisa is the only one who wondered if this was really the power of the relic, because it felt more like a curse. Meanwhile, after using the necklace, Melon also feels the surge of her power. Then, there was a quick flashback. It showed Chris's father talking to Melon earlier. On the note, Chris told his father that someone was targeting the headmaster's seat, so he needed Melon's power to help. Back in the now, Melon asked Chris where he even got this kind of relic. Our boy answered that he got it from someone who was tricked by him. Chris then shrugged and told everyone he had something important to do and was leaving. Hearing this nonsense, Melon was annoyed. She shouted that once all of this was over, Chris was really going to get in trouble with her. But Chris, like a total troll, just waved goodbye and said they could all meet again if they were still alive. Then he disappeared over the edge of the cliff. Marisa could not believe it. She was yelling that Chris was supposed to fight with them, but instead he just left them behind. Jupian was more chill. She felt that Chris had another plan and there was no reason to freak out yet. Marisa didn't get why Jupian was suddenly on Chris' side. Meanwhile, the female assassin said that getting a new relic seemed to fill Marisa's group with false hope. As this happened, she and her group powered up, glowing with dark energy. Marisa got a little scared because she knew that kind of power only came from people at the rare 5-star level. But Melon calmed everyone. She remembered what Chris always told her. Star rank alone does not decide who wins or loses. The arrogant people always trip over their own pride. Chris used to say he loved to take down the cocky types using real talent and skill, not just raw power. So, everyone got hyped for battle. The female assassins scoffed at them and called them arrogant again. Then, the fight finally began. The assassin made a wild, spinning attack, screaming for them to die. She kicked Melon so hard, Melon flew backward. She threw a bunch of slicing energy blades too, and Melon got hit with a cut on her shoulder. The assassin started making fun of Melon. She said Melon was weak and did not even need to see the famous Black Swamp Knights to know it. Melon just laughed back and said, "Was she even really a 5-star? She said the cut was so weak, it just made her shoulder itchy." Suddenly, she sent a massive attack right back. A huge wave of green energy smashed into the assassin. The assassin stumbled, holding her side, and started wondering why she got hurt by a 4-star curse. Melon told her, with a wicked smile, that this relic did not boost normal power. Instead, it made her curse even stronger using her own blood. The assassin started to get scared, thinking they were being tricked on purpose. Melon said it was time to finish things, and rushed in. She slashed the assassin hard across the chest. The assassin's ally shouted and called their captain, but Jupian told them to not get distracted. Then, things moved to another part of the forest. Chris was now all alone, probably looking for somebody. He yelled out, asking if they could stop playing this strange game of hide-and-seek. He wondered if the hidden enemy was just using a special trick, or if they were afraid to show up because they could lose. Right then, the last assassin, the one with a cool black mask, appeared behind Chris. The guy was surprised, but Chris just turned and told him it was finally time to fight. Honestly, Chris was pretty chill, but you could tell he was curious about something. He wondered why that man was there, when he was not even part of the ultimate poison dark magic family. But that mysterious man really wasn't in the mood to talk. When Chris noticed that the man wasn't going to answer, he decided to mess with him. He picked up a tiny stone from the ground and flicked it super hard, like, way harder than anyone thought was possible. The man had to move super fast to dodge it, and when Chris started flicking even more stones, the last stone smacked the man right in the face, and he stumbled back. Oof. Then Chris started giving that man some free advice. He called the man Brother Eshud, and explained that Eshud always raised his shoulder when he was nervous, and when he lost focus, his eyes got weird. Chris told him that was a bad habit and maybe he should try to fix it. Dang. Talk about roasting a guy in the middle of a fight. In the end, the mysterious man took off his ruined mask, and sure enough, he was really Eshud. Chris just looked at him, waiting to see what he'd do next. Flashback time. Viscount Langham sat in his fancy office giving orders to his son. He believed the ultimate poison dark mage would handle Jupian and Marisa, but he still wanted Eshud to chase after Chris, just in case Chris went missing like someone named Mora. Now, Eshud looked rough, bruised and angry. He thought things were totally messed up on this mission. He believed nobody should survive, and he was not happy about it at all. Memories of his subordinate played in his mind. The subordinate said things were falling apart. Jupian's squad wasn't wiped out, Melon was helping out now, and wiping out the expedition team was looking kind of impossible. If Christian died now, people would come after them for sure. Eshud thought this was bad news, especially because he would get in trouble for missing from his home, and even his dad could get caught up in it. Yikes. Suddenly, Chris asked Eshud why he was just standing there like he'd seen a ghost. Our boy teased him, asking if he got scared or something. Eshud suddenly got serious and figured it would be easier to fight now and think later, so he let out some intense dark magic, and things really got going. He charged at Chris and even made 2 magic clones of himself. They all attacked Chris at once. It looked super unfair, like some video game cheat move. But Chris did not freak out. He used his sword, glowing with purple energy, and fought back. Then the real Eshud attacked too, shouting that Chris should die. But, when the attack almost hit Chris, bam! Eshud was gone in a flash. He pulled his own sneaky trick and appeared behind Chris again like a total ninja. Our boy could not believe it. Then, he got a big hit. But after that big attack, Chris was not dead yet. He revealed his true dark sword. It was like a tornado of purple and black energy, crazy strong and super flashy. Looking at that, Eshud could only be shocked. The fuck, where did this power come from? Chris unleashed the move, smashing Eshud so hard that the ground exploded and Eshud went flying, rolling and coughing up blood. It was brutal, dude. Eshud lay there, defeated, and wondered why this all happened. For a second, he never thought how a brat from a branch member could really defeat him like this. Now, Chris looked at Eshud and told him he should just admit he lost. He said if Eshud admitted defeat, he would let it slide. But nope, Eshud totally hated the idea. But wait, Chris might know about the whole secret plan. He thought he should try to get rid of Chris to cover his own tracks, but he decided now was not the moment. Chris was too tricky to deal with, and he is injured right now. In the end, he said thanks to Chris for saving his reputation, pretending to be grateful. Chris grinned and said he was showing some mercy, but then, plot twist, he totally tricked Eshud. He pretended to reach out a hand to help, but his hand was glowing with even more purple energy. Total fake out. There was a huge burst of magic, and Eshud got blasted backward, coughing up even more blood. Now Eshud was super mad, calling Chris some pretty harsh names in his head. Chris just stood there, all smug, and said everything Eshud just saw was fake. Bro. Chris was way too savage. Anyway, after the fight, Chris rushed back to Jupian and Marisa. He was annoyed because things took way longer than he expected. He hoped his friends were still doing okay. Just then, everyone arrived, calling out for Christian like he was their missing dog or something. Our boy could only shiver. Everyone looked like they had already lost their mind. Suddenly, Marisa turned bright red and told Chris he should really get his ass kicked. Meanwhile, Melon reported to Chris that their mission was done. Chris then asked what they should do about those dark mages from the ultimate poison dark magic family. Melon said those dark mages were already gone, turned into ash. She figured they made sure not to leave any evidence behind. Chris said good job, but Jupian cut the crap and asked where Chris had been this whole time. Chris just played it casual. He told them he was only scouting the area. Marisa wasn't buying it though. She noticed that Chris came back with some injuries and asked if there were actually more traitors from her family. Chris told her not to worry. He said he took care of things off to the side and whoever he fought was either back home by now or got picked up by helpers. He just wanted everyone to leave the area quickly. But in his mind, our boy thought the whole thing about working together on this mission was a joke. He believed Viscount Langham tried to cause chaos on purpose. Still, thank God he got the relic, and he could save everyone that was supposed to die. This alone was enough for him. Fast forward 1 week, Chris was chilling at a giant dining table and thought that everything was wrapped easily. The poison magic family got the heavy complaint, but in the end, the deal was fast because he knew Viscount Langham had tried his best to conclude everything. Of course, if everything continues to be investigated, he will also be caught playing a role in this murder mission. Anyway, Marie was fussing over him now. Yeah, she was always dramatic. She complained that while Chris slept so well and seemed carefree, she hurt all over because he always ignored her. Chris joked back and wondered if she even had a heart. Marie pretended that her heart was pounding loudly just because Chris was around. She said she would even love him if he was mean or rough, which made Chris freak out and tell her to stop being weird. Marie just laughed and kept acting silly, trying to feed Chris by hand like he was a little kid. Chris got embarrassed and grumbled that he could eat by himself. Yet Marie teased him even more and said he'd need to eat well or else he would not be strong at night. Chris spit out his food in shock, totally flustered. Dude, that lady had no filter. Somehow, on the other side of the table, Jupian was there witnessing all this crap. Chris asked her how long she was planning to stay, noting that she must not be feeling well yet. Jupian said she still felt responsible and would stay a bit longer to watch over things. Suddenly, Marie got angry and yelled, "How dare Jupian try to seduce his man?" But Jupian just shut her up and ordered her to bring some juice. In the end, Marie could only pout and go to the kitchen. Back to Jupian and Chris. Our boy wanted to know if she had more to say. Jupian just said she hated him and wanted to get rid of him someday. Our MC was unfazed and just told her, "Fine, whatever." But Jupian suddenly blushed and thanked him for helping this time. Chris, being a troll, played hard to hear and made her repeat it. Jupian insisted she was just acknowledging what Chris did, nothing more. She said this would be the last time she'd act friendly, and that the Marquess had agreed to recognize Chris as the young lord of the family, at least for now. But if Chris really took that job, things would get tough, and he'd need to act seriously. Chris thought to himself that everything would change once he became the real young lord. Right now he was a nobody to most, but once he stepped up all the big players would come after him. He worried that even people like Koa, Yulian, the first princess with secret plans, Mazak, the explosive third young lady, Sarad, the young lord of Berserker, and more would try to take him down. He wondered if Jupian herself would become his rival one day. Jupian joked, asking if he was staring at her because she was pretty. That caught Chris off guard. She stammered, saying it wasn't that, and then quickly tried to leave. Jupian left first, and Chris was just exhausted. He muttered that he needed something to recharge and started eating again. Right then, someone came to his dining table again and made Chris's blood boil. Why does everyone like to bother him? But when he looked at the one to disturb him, there was Marisa standing. Suddenly, Marisa tried to act all casual as she asked if he was okay. Chris was still wearing a bandage on his cheek and said, yes, he was fine. Chris thought to himself, wondering why Marisa came. He wondered if it was because he had tied her in the mission before. Seriously, he felt a little nervous for good reasons. Yet, Marisa told him she was there because her father wanted her to see Chris. But in his own head, Chris was kind of freaking out, because Marisa's dad was Duke Huam, who was not just a big deal, but the head boss of the ultimate poison dark magic family, an actual 8-star demon lord. Chris thought, why would such a scary guy even care about him? Then, the two of them started walking down a super fancy hallway. Marisa asked Chris how he figured out someone was plotting against them. Chris just said he had a source. Marisa just looked down and remembered how she got tied up to a tree when Melon introduced herself as the vice commander of the Dark Mages Knights. Melon explained that Chris told her to sneak in because someone was targeting the whole team. Chris wanted Marisa, the big shot of the powerful family, to be helped by her. Back in the present, Marisa's mind was spinning. She asked why, if Chris knew all that, why did he have to tie her up? Why not just give her a hint instead? Chris then confessed he was worried about her safety. He was honestly worried, because if her family was the real villain, she might be in danger since she was next in line to take over as the successor. Hearing all of that, Marisa was surprised. She blushed, and then thanked him for saving everyone's lives. Chris said it was nothing, because Marisa was important to him. That caught Marisa off guard, and she totally panicked inside. She thought their relationship was already over, so why was he acting all sweet now? But Chris quickly changed the mood. He said they should have a politically cooperative relationship instead. Marisa almost fainted. Chris basically told her to trust him. She doesn't need to come here again just because they were once engaged. In the end, he tried his best to convince her they were perfect stranger. Bro is the worst and can't read any romance. Marisa just hid her face for a second, then gave a scary smile and accepted the idea. She said it would be for the good of both families. Chris couldn't tell if he'd messed up or not, but it was way too late to back out. They finally arrived at a giant set of doors. Marisa announced Chris to the patriarch. Inside was Duke Huam, smiling like a big-time villain but acting like a softy dad. He even wanted Marisa to call him dad and not patriarch. Marisa told him to be more serious in front of Chris, but Duke Huam joked about it and then asked everyone to sit down for dinner. Looking at that, Chris thought these people got along way better than he expected. He had never imagined that someone as scary as Duke Huam would act all nice and fatherly.